My name is Neel Kashkari. I'm president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our 7th annual Regional Economic Conditions Conference. The Minneapolis Fed represents the 9th Federal Reserve District, 9 of 12 districts, and that's Minnesota, North and South Dakota, Montana, the Upper Peninsula, Michigan, and northwestern Wisconsin. A big part of our jobs are to go out and understand what's happening across our regional economy. And then I go back to Washington, D.C. every 6 weeks for Federal Open Market Committee meetings. And part of what I'm doing in those meetings is talking about what's happening in our regional economy. Well, in addition to my colleagues and I going out across our region, once a year we convene experts from around the region to bring their economic insights from their states and their corners of the 9th District here to us. And that's what this Regional Economic Conditions Conference represents. We have experts. I'm excited about today's conference from across the district to share their views on inflation, on the labor market, what sectors are doing well, what sectors are slowing. And at this conference, we always have one signature keynote speaker, a leader from our region. It could be a political leader or a civic leader or a business leader to share their own economic insights and what they're seeing either in their state, in their corner of the district, or in their industry sector. And today, I'm very pleased that we have an excellent business leader here from Minnesota and nationally, David Mortenson, chairman of the Mortenson Construction Company. Now, Mortenson Construction is one of the largest construction companies in America, and they're a top 20 developer. They focus on commercial, institutional, corporate, and energy sectors here in Minnesota and across the country. And they're some of the largest builders of renewable energy projects in America, but also of sports stadiums and arenas here in America. And that's, I think, particularly relevant because we know that there's been a lot of consumer demand for recreation, a lot of consumer demand for entertainment. And so having David with us here today is particularly timely. So first of all, David, welcome. Thank you for joining the Minneapolis Fed. In full disclosure, David is a friend of mine, and David is somebody who I routinely will call to get insights on what's happening in the regional economy. But thank you on behalf of my colleagues for being with us here today.
Oh, Neel, it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for your leadership and helping guide us to what everybody's predicting to be a soft landing.
Well, may those predictions be right. I hope so. Let's start in the construction sector. You have a huge footprint across America. Can you just give us a lay of the land? What are you seeing?
Yeah, so two things I always say in our industry, in the commercial construction industry, our economic indicators are actually pretty easy. More tower cranes, good. Less tower cranes, not so good. And obviously the interest rate environment has actually slowed construction, especially in multifamily and even in corporate customers. So regionally, if you look across the Twin Cities, you see fewer tower cranes. Mm-hmm. But it's kind of a tale of two dichotomies because you've got regional slowing, but you've got some markets that are really strong. I mean, renewable energy is one. The American Clean Energy Association is predicting a doubling of both solar and wind over the next 5 years. Huge growth, really spawned by the Inflation Reduction Act. The CHIPS Act is spurring a lot of semiconductor building. You've got electric vehicles, battery plants, the reshoring of manufacturing because of global uncertainty. So in a bunch of regions and across, that's why if you look generally, construction employment is pretty stable, even though it looks like construction here in the Twin Cities is down.
So that's, you just touched on something that is a little bit of a conundrum for me as a monetary policymaker. You know, when we raise interest rates, traditionally the most interest rate sensitive sector of the economy is construction and housing. And I would have guessed, given how much we've raised interest rates in the past couple of years, I would have guessed that construction employment would have fallen rather quickly. Just as you said, that hasn't happened. Right. And so I guess you're saying that hasn't happened because of these other fiscal actions that have taken place. Is that right?
I mean, it's that plus there are a couple other things that are, I would say, you talked about sports, for example.
Yeah.
You know, COVID put all of that on hold because sports teams didn't know what demand was going to be. And so all of a sudden there was this pent-up demand. So that's a private sector with pent-up demand that's just starting to rear itself from post-COVID early 2020. But I think most of what we're seeing in the public sector is a good example. a lot of those are ARPA dollars, and a lot of the federal spending is still making its way through that digestive system of that economic snake.
You know, as a monetary policymaker, one of the things that we think about is the neutral interest rate, which is what interest rate balances savings and investment. And before the pandemic hit, we thought the neutral interest rate, and I thought it was very low. And then there's a lot of reasons to think that once we get through this transition period, we're going to revert back to that low neutral interest rate. But it's also possible that in the short run, that neutral interest rate has gone up because of a confluence of the reopening, the pent-up demand that you talked about, the fiscal stimulus coming in. And if the neutral interest rate is higher, then monetary policy is not as tight as we otherwise would have assumed it would be.
Yeah.
Does this resonate with you as a construction builder?
You know, I frankly would have said two things pre-pandemic is, one, we had been in such a low interest rate environment for so long, it was enabling things to happen that probably
Should not have?
should not have
Sure,
happened.
sure.
And so it wouldn't surprise me that that neutral interest rate doesn't go back and revert to where it was in 2018, 2019, that we actually find a new normal. And I personally think that would probably be a good thing, maybe even give you, in terms of monetary policy, more flexibility, both on the up and down side.
Right, right. How about, so you talked about construction employment has not really moderated. If somebody came to you and said, let's say Minnesota has new stadiums, they're probably not going to build another one, but if they came and said, we want to build a big new stadium, would you be able to find the workers to do it?
Right now, here in the Twin Cities, yes.
You could.
Yes. And, you know, it's interesting because if you look at our inflation predictions for 2024, and we do this regionally, so, you know, the market has slowed here more than it has in other places. So there's enough capacity. In a place like Phoenix, which currently has the largest construction project I know of that's underway.
And what is that?
That's Taiwan Semiconductor. They have 10,000 men and women on their construction job site.
Wow.
So inflation in the Phoenix area is twice what it is here in the Twin Cities in the construction market. And part of that is just what it takes to attract workers. And they're getting people who are traveling from New Mexico, Colorado, Nevada, California to go and work on that job site.
So that's something we saw. You know, I've heard businesses complain about labor shortages in this region since I've been here. So I'm beginning my 9th year at the Minneapolis Fed. So it's been quite a while. And well, one of the things that I always point the businesses to is when North Dakota had its oil boom, let's say in 2014, 2015, they drew in workers from all around the country in response to much higher wages. Now, you can't do that nationally, right? I mean, it may work if one region is hot and another region is cold. You can draw those workers in. But as you look around the country as a whole, what would be your sense of the labor supply for your industry?
If you look at the macro data, and I go back all the way to before the Great Recession. So we had 7.5 million people in residential and commercial construction. We lost 2 million people in the Great Recession. It took us the next 15 years to regain, and we've been pretty stable around that 7.5 million workers in the construction market today. The problem that we have in our industry is productivity is not changing as fast as you see it change in manufacturing. And that's one of the things that we're going to be in a tight labor market forever. If we don't actually change our productivity curve, we're really, I think, going to be in trouble in the next decade.
All right, so this is maybe an interesting topic that I wasn't planning on covering, but it's really interesting, so I want to cover it with you because you're an expert. I see all of these pilot projects of new ways of doing construction, and there's a lot of excitement around it. How excited are you about those? I'm skeptical when I see them, just to be honest with you.
Right. I'm very excited about it, frankly, but these things take a long time. We have a very complex, segmented, and fractured industry. If you knew about Katera, which was a SoftBank-backed startup that was trying to reinvent the design and construction market and prefabricate absolutely everything and deliver it just in time. That was a $1.5 billion kapoof.
Wow.
Because they tried to do way too much, way too fast. We currently have 3 manufacturing facilities, and we are seeing others in the market take a slower, let's figure out how to deliver certain pieces and then grow once we get our feet under the ground. In 20 years, Neel, I think construction sites are going to look a lot more like a shipbuilding or airplane building manufacturing facility than they do in this custom-made, stick-built, cut every piece on-site scenario.
It's funny, you think about somebody, whether it's an individual family saying we're going to build our own home, or a business saying we want to build our own factory. It's hard to get your mind around. You're not going to get exactly what you want, right? You have to sacrifice, but it's going to end up being cheaper, hopefully.
Yeah, cheaper, faster, higher quality. I mean, that's going to be the promise that needs to be delivered.
There's so much hype right now about AI. Are you seeing any applications of AI in your line of work yet?
We call it generative design.
Okay.
And so if you think about a wind project, for example, it used to be a bunch of smart engineers would look at the data and decide where to put the towers and what the best cost scenario might be. Today we can put all of that in a computer model and overnight run through 1 million different scenarios. And so that's actually allowing us to take 3, 4, 5% out of the cost infrastructure of those projects because we're leveraging that computing power.
So that's real.
It's real. Yeah. But we're just scratching at the surface like most industries are.
Right. Interesting. Okay, so we've covered the labor market. You touched on inflation. It's lower here. It's higher in some areas. As you look ahead for inflation, are you optimistic? I mean, inflation's a big driver of cost in your industry.
Yeah, I mean, it was huge. Our industry was in 2021, we are experiencing double-digit inflation. And again, that varied, but anywhere between 10 and 15%, depending upon what region we were in. Today, 2023, we were in the 2.5%. Here locally, we're projecting 2.5%, maybe 3% for this year. And part of that is because the market's softer, so there's a little more hunger in the supply chain because we still have wages going up. And I'll give you an example. If you look at unionized wages, where we've got 2, 3, 4-year contracts, those wages are going up anywhere between 3.5% and 4% for the next 3 years.
Per year for the next 3 years. Got it.
So we know that, which tends to be 30 to 40% of the cost on a job site, we know that segment is going to be higher than the national inflation rate.
And what would those numbers have been prior to the pandemic? Do you have ballpark?
Yes, prior to the pandemic, they were in the 2.5% range. Most of those negotiations, because we saw such big increases in 21, 22, that first year they got big jumps, and then everybody anticipated inflation would come back down, and that's why these years are actually lower than they were in 22.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because and my colleagues and I spent a lot of time, we have a lot of contacts in the labor sector to try to understand how are their negotiations going, because it's actually a sign of are inflation expectations anchored or not.
Right.
And if everybody believed that we're going to get inflation back down in a few years, that leads to a different type of negotiation. And thankfully, those expectations were still there.
Yes.
And then the actions I think the Fed took helped to reinforce those expectations. So it was a sigh of relief when we saw that.
It is interesting because it becomes a important feedback loop that informs each other.
Correct.
And it could have gone the other way.
Yeah. Okay, so you got a sense on wages. Now you touched on supply chains. The supply chains are getting better. We see that in the national data.
Yeah.
I still hear anecdotes. One thing that has come up randomly, certain electrical transformers and these things that are critical for buildings, you still can't get them. Is it getting better, or where are we?
No, that's absolutely true.
Is that right?
I mean, some transformers are 52-week lead times. It's the first thing we order on a job site. It used to be the first thing we'd order is the steel. Today, it's the electrical gear.
Wow.
And that makes sense when you think about what parts of our economy are booming: chip plants, data centers, renewable energy, battery plants, new factories for electric cars, all things that are intensive electrically. And it has a corollary in terms of employment on our job sites. The tightest labor profession on our projects is the electrical craft people.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. And are you seeing, when I hear that it's transformers are probably very high tech, and I'm not giving them enough credit, but it seems like new suppliers should be coming in to flood the market with transformers to fill this demand. But maybe they just anticipate it's going to be short-lived, and so it doesn't make sense to build a new transformer factory.
Well, I think there are two things happening there. One is a lot of that supply is coming from abroad.
I see.
Two, it's very tightly regulated market. So in terms of getting approvals for the electrical components and the certifications is also a long process.
I see.
So it's harder for a new entrant just to come in and start making something they haven't made before.
I see. Okay, let's jump around a little bit. I know we're covering a lot, but this is very helpful, so I appreciate it. You talked about reshoring and friendshoring as a trend. What are you seeing in terms of regional trade? Are we seeing different trade patterns with Canada, Mexico, companies bringing factories back there? I'm just, any lay of the land?
Yeah, I don't know if I can give you any insight into what's happening to countries adjacent to the United States, but certainly you've got the reshoring that's part of a response to global uncertainty, but we have a huge reshoring of solar manufacturing that's happening right now.
Back to the domestic U.S.
To the domestic U.S. It almost didn't exist 5 years ago. And now, because the Inflation Reduction Act requires domestic content,
I see.
you get a 10% bonus on your tax incentive. And so we've probably priced $5 billion solar manufacturing facilities in the last 12 months.
Wow.
And those aren't being built here in your region, but they really are across the Southeast and the Southwest.
I see. Okay, so as you look at your, Mortenson's a diversified construction company, big industrial projects. What sectors within that are you most bullish about for, let's say, the next 5 or 10 years, and are you most cautious about?
Let me start with bullish.
Okay.
The renewable energy business is going to be really strong. It's very interesting, Neel, because there are 2 Minnesota-based companies that have been installing about 45% of the wind energy across the country for the last 25 years. And part of that was because Xcel Energy was a leader in the mid-90s of starting to experiment with wind. And so they hired their local connections in both design and construction, and we started to build our capabilities and capacities. And so we punch way above our weight here in the region. And we've got this great wind resource across southwestern Minnesota and the western or the eastern side of the Dakotas. If states in the country are going to meet our transformation to clean energy, it's really going to benefit our region long term. So really bullish on renewable energy. The thing we're going to have to figure out is transmission. That's going to be the bottleneck in the next 5 to 6 years. Data centers, and everybody's preparing for AI. You're starting to see Meta announced a big billion-dollar data center here in Rosemont just 3 or 4 months ago. We're seeing that across the country. Those are the 2 biggest sectors we're seeing exploding. That and the manufacturing piece. The things that are got long-term issues, office is number 1.
Right.
I think it's going to take 5 or 6 years to work through all the dynamics in the office market.
And you've mentioned to me in the past that you all are participating in seeing opportunities, trying to renew buildings. Can you just walk us through that? How's it going? What are you learning?
Yeah, it's interesting. I when the Great Recession hit, I thought the commercial uh, real estate market would have corrected itself faster than it did. I'm seeing that happen a little more quickly this time
Hmm.
as people are recognizing that these assets aren't going to bounce back quickly. So I'll give you an example. We participated in buying a building in downtown Minneapolis, went back to the bank with an outstanding mortgage. The bank put it for auction. We bought it for half the outstanding debt,
Wow.
less than $100 a square foot. That gave us enough room to put a bunch of capital to reposition the asset back in the marketplace. I think we're gonna see a lot of that happening over the next 5 or 6 years, but every building's in a different position in
Yeah.
terms of long-term lease rates and debt. You're gonna see some of those buildings too convert to residential.
And talk about that, because that gets a lot of attention. It
Yeah,
sounds very optimistic. And then I talk to experts and they say, boy, it's pretty tricky to pull off, and not every building lends itself to it.
yeah, very few buildings lend
Oh,
itself
is that
to
right?
it. Yeah, I mean, it's probably in the 15% range that actually um, have the infrastructure and the floor plate that would enable a cost-effective conversion to happen.
I see. And will you see people bring down these buildings?
I
Or
don't,
is that's just too expensive?
I don't think so, Neil. I mean, my long-term view is we built all these infrastructures to our urban core.
Hmm.
Our urban core has the things that most people want: entertainment, um, parks,
Restaurants. Yeah.
restaurants, and it's just going to take a while for us to work through what we need to do to reposition, which is going to also help bring more people back to work.
And when you think about Mortenson's, you have offices all around the country. Um, if a young person was talking about joining Mortenson,
Yeah.
would you say, hey, go to Denver, go to DC? Where would you encourage them to go see the growth?
That's an interesting question. You know, and, and we have offices mostly in the Western United States. Um, and I think that question is answered by what they want personally.
I see.
Um, we're seeing people who want more affordable housing and access to parks really excited about coming to the Twin Cities. But we watch people who want a little more sunshine and access to skiing say, I want to be in Denver. Um, but if you looked at trends of where people are moving, the Southeast and the Southwest are the dominant places in America where people are moving, and that's bringing new job opportunities too.
So I'm just curious, because in Minnesota, I hear from a lot of the business leaders who love a lot about Minnesota, but they're frustrated by some of the fiscal policies in Minnesota, especially they point to the local taxes. And they say, look, we can move our business south and have lower taxes. I'm just curious, as a business, somebody who runs a big business, how do you look at the relative strengths, the relative challenges facing these different regions? Some of them you can do something about, some of them you can't do anything about.
Yeah. Well, we don't make our decisions on where we're growing or where we're going to invest based on tax circumstances. We're responding to our customers in the marketplace. We've been here in the Twin Cities for 70 years. We're going to continue to grow our presence here. But what I do see from our customers who are making decisions about where they're going to put their new plant, it tends to go where labor and tax policy is more favorable. So we don't see a big boom in manufacturing here. Again, we see it in the Southeast and the Southwest where um, they've got more favorable conditions. They're also trying to diversify where their manufacturing bases are too.
Sure. Is there a difference for you in how long, we know when we study the housing market, residential market, we know the residential market is really influenced by local policies,
Mm.
zoning, for
Yes.
example. Um, And affordable housing is a top topic of conversation all around this region. And I always point people to, you got to look in the mirror because it's really driven by local policies that are driving these costs up. As you look at time to build a plant or time to build a stadium, are there big regional differences?
Yes,
There are.
yes, and they're a reflection of that regulatory environment. Um, and Texas is a great example. Very low regulatory environment. Building costs there are probably 35–40% less than they are in California, where you have a very high regulatory environment. Of course, you got land cost differentials also, but so.
And where would Minnesota be if California is here and Texas is here?
Texas would be in, Minnesota would be in the middle.
Okay.
But there are lots of things that we could do in public-private partnerships to make it easier, to make it smoother, to make it more quickly to respond to the marketplace, to build the employment base. As a region, we're not attracting as many new people into the region as we need to be if we're going to be as successful in the future as we have in the past.
And what are some of the key, you mentioned public-private partnerships, are there other key policy things that you think would be top of mind if you were to give advice to regional leaders?
Yeah, I think the regulatory environment's an important one because it helps keep our cost structure low and it enables us to respond faster. I think the tax environment, both on the personal side of the equation and on the corporate side of the equation, we could do things that would help enable us to attract more businesses and attract more people.
Interesting, interesting. As you look, if we can jump back to the renewable energy sector for a bit, are you at all, because I consider you to be an expert in the economics of these projects, what is, Germany, from what I understand, was a big leader in solar for many years, even though Germany as a country is not actually a great solar footprint because they had a lot of subsidies. And then it became kind of clear that once the subsidies would eventually end, those plants would not, or those solar farms would not make economic sense anymore. As you think about wind and solar in America, are we getting closer to the place where they're not going to need government support in order to be competitive?
Yeah. It's interesting little history because it used to be that Congress would pass the tax incentive just for a year or 2 years.
Right, so especially like on wind, it would go for 2 years.
Especially on wind. And so we'd build 12 projects and then they wouldn't pass anything and we wouldn't build any projects. So the industry actually went to Congress and said, let's have a tax policy that takes us to zero and creates certainty. Because if we had that, then we can build our supply chains and actually take cost out of the process. And so that existed before the IRA, and we were on a sliding scale to zero. We were still putting more wind in place every year than we were the previous year. And technology was advancing, supply chains were taking costs out of the process. And then the Inflation Reduction Act was, hey, if we're going to get to a clean energy future, we've got to build faster. So that tax policy came back in and it has been a boon to putting more megawatts of renewable energy into the system. Give you some cost parameters. Everybody's like, well, wind's not as, it's costing people more, wind's not as cost competitive. Colorado just went through a major competition for about 5 gigawatts of wind. And so 5,000 megawatts, the average cost was in that $22 a megawatt. At $3.25 for natural gas, the cost to operate and produce electricity from a natural gas plant is in the $30 to $35 a megawatt. So we're actually putting clean energy into the system that's cheaper than other forms of energy. And yes, that $22 a megawatt on wind includes the tax incentive, but you take that tax incentive out and it's still going to be close to competitive. Solar's not quite there yet.
I see. That's interesting. And when you talk to, let's say, power companies in the region, are they as bullish as they have been, or maybe more so?
I, I mean, I'd say more so because if you talk to Excel Energy 10 years ago, they would have said, well, maybe wind can be 15% of our base load because it's too variable.
Sure,
Well, what they've been able to figure out is, yes, it's variable, but it's very predictable.
I see.
And so, and they've been able to come up with the right mix. And so their projections and predictions about how much renewable energy can actually be part of base load is a lot bigger today than it was 10 years ago.
And you mentioned that transmission is going to be a key bottleneck. I've been hearing about this for 20 years.
Yeah,
Are we making any progress?
slow. Um, Slow progress. It's still, again, is if you think about these regional transmission, like MISO is a regional transmission regulator, that's a very slow process. One of the reasons Texas has the most renewable energy of any state in the country is they're able to build transmission inside state boundaries, and they were able to do it much faster than we're able to do it in this kind of cross state lines, border, MISO environment.
I see. I see. Interesting. Now let's just shift back to the economy, if you
Yeah.
don't mind. You touched on it at the opening that a lot of hope for a soft landing. How are you feeling about the economic outlook this year, not just in your sector, just about the economy in general?
I'm probably not a great person to ask because I'm an optimist by nature.
Well, I like asking optimists. That's good.
But I'm feeling really good. Part of that is we have very diversified business. That helps. But you know, I can see, you can see the demand pieces of places like the healthcare system. Our healthcare system is struggling financially, but there's still demand and need to build more healthcare. That may have slowed in the near term, but it's going to be a big part of our business and the regional economy in the next 10 years because
We're aging.
we're aging and there's just a demand there. So, and I think the housing pieces will sort themselves out. Our expectation is interest rates will continue to come down and stabilize. That will be helpful. And I think both nationally and regionally, I'm very optimistic about the next 2 to 5 years.
And it's funny you mentioned interest rates coming down. It's gotten a lot of attention that the expectations of monetary policy have shifted a lot.
Yeah.
Right? People have gotten excited. Maybe rate cuts would be coming. And if you can see that manifest in the 10-year Treasury yield from 5%, it's come down to around 4%. Has that movement, what we would call an easing of financial conditions, have you seen that? Does that translate into your business, like directly?
It does, and I'll give you a couple examples. We started negotiating with banks in November for debt for a development project that we've got going in Colorado. And we were right on the margin of whether or not that project was going to work or not. By the time we got all of the pieces and components in place and we're about ready to close on our debt, it's 75 basis points less than what it was. And that opens the aperture to investors because the returns are going to be a little bit better. That puts us in a place where we're now putting stuff back on the drawing boards that we put off last fall.
And are you seeing that? One area that I'm very aware of is in this region. We know the single family home building slowed down a lot in response to monetary policy, but it seemed like there was still a boom of multifamily in this region. When I would drive to work, I would just see construction projects all the way along 394. A lot of those have been finished now.
Yeah.
Are there more yet to come, or are those on hold pending the rate environment?
I think they're more interest rate sensitive, just like the single family home. We've got a number of pieces of land that we're trying to do multifamily on, and we need rates to come down another 100 basis points before we think they're viable.
I see.
But I still think, Neel, that there's demand in the marketplace. Everybody thought when you'd be in downtown Minneapolis and there are 10 tower cranes building residential that we were outstripping demand, but the vacancy or rates almost never changed. They were always hovering in that kind of 3 to 5% range, even as that new supply came into the market.
And are you seeing trends like that all around the country, or is Minnesota somehow different?
Well, I think we think a boom is 10 tower cranes. Um, in,
In Minnesota?
in Minnesota,
Yeah.
there might have been 30 or 40 building residential in other cities. So, I think the Great Recession, we underbuilt for so long, we still got ground to make up.
Right, right. And are you seeing one big surprise for us in terms of a positive surprise in the last few years is that there's been a lot more labor supply than we had forecast. The Great Recession took a much longer time for the labor market to recover. Thankfully, it's recovered more quickly. One of the impetuses or one of the contributors to that is a lot of immigration coming into the country, and they're actually showing up and they're at work, and you can see it in the national statistics.
Yeah,
I'm curious if you're seeing that in you hire people all around the country.
yeah.
Are you seeing that affect your jobs?
Um, that's a good question. I don't know if I have any specific data. Um, Construction employment has always been a home for immigrants.
Yes.
That's how my great-grandfather, when he came from Malmo, Sweden at 18, was with his toolbox. We certainly see that with Central American immigration in the Southwest. Maybe not as much here in the Midwest, but um, I think, one of the big conundrums that we face as a country is that we haven't figured out our immigration um, opportunity,
Right.
and we're missing huge opportunity.
Yeah.
I mean, the biggest place I see it is we have interns who are working for us from college, super smart men and women from different countries around the world, and then we can't get them a green card
Yeah.
when they graduate. That is just a travesty.
Yeah. It's insanity.
Yeah.
And you see some other countries like Canada seems to me it has a much more rational immigration system that's designed to feed the economy, which seems like an obvious thing to do.
And that, we've been the place where the best and brightest wanted to be anywhere in the world. And now we're losing that status. Just came from Chile and Argentina over the Christmas holiday, and talking to people there, like, would you ever come? Well, I can't get a visa. I'd love to come to the United States, but it's the most difficult country in the world for me to get to right now.
Wow. Wow. That's not good news.
No,
That's not
we've
good.
got to change that.
Yeah. What else is top of mind? What keeps you up at night? Anything that we haven't covered?
No, I think, for us, the thing that I'm most focused on is how do we be better collaborators across public and private sectors to help inform and make our communities and our regions stronger? Because when we do that together, it makes a difference. And unfortunately, in this polarized political world, there's less of that happening today than there was 10 years ago. And we've got to change, I think, that trajectory.
Got it. Well, I want to thank David for joining us here today. This is a terrific conversation. We covered a lot of ground, totally relevant to how we think about the economy and monetary policy. And I also want to thank you for you're a great resource for me and my colleagues at the Minneapolis Fed, sharing all of these insights. So really appreciate you being with us here today, David. Thank you.
Been a huge pleasure, privilege. Thank you for the great work that you and your team are doing.
Thank you. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Ron Wirtz, Regional Outreach Director, for a presentation on our own district-wide construction survey. Ron, over to you.
Thank you, Neil, and thank you especially to David for that great conversation. Again, let me just say thank you to David for taking the time to participate in this conference. Really important that we get a great keynote speaker. We really just appreciate him sharing that knowledge and expertise in the industry. I hope you enjoyed it really as much as I did. So Neil introduced me as Ron Wirtz. I am the Regional Outreach Director here at the Minneapolis Fed, and I'm also involved in tracking the regional economy and tracking the construction sector specifically. So we're going to transition to some of that district-specific content now. Let me just share screen quick. So The next thing that we're going to cover, I'm going to do a quick recap of the construction sector via one of the surveys that we do. And after that, I'll finish promptly at 10 a.m. or maybe even a little bit sooner than that. Then after that, we have two different panel discussions that will focus on the ninth district. There'll be one on labor markets and the second one on state economic conditions. And we'll feature experts from each of those states to give you a little bit of flavor from each of those states. So before I get started on my own recap, there are just a few housekeeping items for today's webinar that I just want to quickly cover. All presenter slides and a copy of the video link will be posted to the event page following today's webinar, and that'll probably be posted next week sometime. We'd also love to get your feedback at the end of this webinar. So please take a moment to fill out the brief 3-question survey that pops up in your Zoom window when you exit. So with that, let me start on my presentation. So again, I'm going to cover construction conditions in the ninth district, and this is these are from the results that we get from a biannual construction survey that we do across the ninth district. First, I have to give you a bit of a disclaimer that the views expressed here are the presenters, and they are not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis or the Federal Reserve System. So let me give you a little bit of background on the survey itself, just for a little level setting. So this is the largest regularly conducted construction-focused survey among the 12 district banks in the Federal Reserve System. And we use a partner model. And basically what happens is we do the survey, but we distribute it through a number of construction trade organizations that distribute it to their members. And the value in this partner model is that it really gives the Minneapolis Fed, our partners, and their members, as well as the public, gives them timely insights on current economic conditions in the construction sector. The most recent one we did was in mid-November. We got a little bit more than 300 responses, which we were really happy with. Most of them were in the residential and or commercial sector. We had smaller shares in infrastructure and industrial, but we really like their involvement because they tend to be much larger firms, much like Mortenson Construction. They tend to be involved with much larger projects and revenue spending. I do want to remind everyone, though, that results are a snapshot. This is not a scientifically sampled survey. So again, all the results, please interpret carefully. So let me give you a few takeaways before I kind of launch into the specifics. So generally speaking, we're seeing that negative revenue and profit trends that we've seen established, roughly a year ago. Those trends, seem to be continuing, unfortunately. Residential is seeing the worst outcomes and by a pretty sizable margin. And I'll go into more detail on that. We are also seeing maybe a little bit more concerning is that we're seeing that new and future projects out for bid are declining, and we're seeing a shrinkage of backlogs. We know that there are lots of a lot of challenges, some of which David and Neel talked about: high interest rates, high input costs, and labor costs. There is a little bit of good news. As David also discussed, supply chains seem to be improving. I'll offer a little bit of evidence on that. Price inflation is moderating as well. It's still not great, but it's moderating. Demand is still healthy. That's something that we just heard about as well. I'll offer a little evidence on that. And that labor availability is also improving. And generally speaking, results are actually quite similar to what we saw in November 2022. I wouldn't call that either good or bad news, but we're not seeing necessarily a lot of change, especially in sentiment. So the outlook overall is that we kind of expect things to continue on this path. The overall sentiment has been pretty flat. It seems like there's a lot of caution in the market, I think, with good reason. So with that, let me talk about some specifics. So when we talk about recent revenue and profit trends, let me give you a little orientation on some of the charts themselves. So when we're asking a lot of different questions, we're asking about kind of up or down and to what degree. So generally speaking, red means bad or decline, green means good or increase. So what you see here is a general question of what's happened in your most recent quarter compared to the previous year. And then the number of bars represent different surveys over the last 2.5 years. So what you see here is that the revenue trend really started to take hold in terms of decline in April of 2022, right there in the middle of the chart. And what we've seen is that there's been a steady erosion of revenue growth over the last 1.5 years or so, roughly in line with when inflation showed up and the Fed started raising interest rates. In terms of company profits, we haven't been asking this question quite as long. But generally, you're seeing kind of the same trend. profit levels have been falling really from quite high levels, and we're not really expected them to improve much over the short term. So if you look at the bottom bar of each graph, November 2023, November 2023, you're seeing that profits are generally falling for more firms than they are growing for firms, and they kind of expect that on the bottom chart for that to continue going forward in the coming quarter as well. So we also ask firms when they respond to give us a little bit of information on different things like what state are they located in, but more importantly, things like what sector of the industry do you have most of your work? And you can check all 4 boxes if you're that big of a firm. Generally, most are checking 1 to 3 boxes, but it gives us an idea of where we can see some of the sectoral differences. And what you can see here pretty clearly is that residential and commercial are seeing the poorest revenue trends. Not only over the summer and fall, but we've been seeing that really for several surveys now as well. I would say infrastructure and industrial are still positive, especially if you look at the summer trend, the top chart. Infrastructure and industrial are still really quite positive in terms of their revenue trends. I do see some compression, not only over time, but particularly in this most recent fall quarter, you're seeing that there's a little bit of compression where maybe things aren't quite as good as they were. I also like to do a little bit of triangulation to see what partner members are telling us versus what we're seeing in the data. And this chart is from Dodge Data and Analytics, and it really does kind of reinforce what firms are telling us. So this is a chart that is a 6-month rolling average for total value of construction starts over a 5-state region in the 9th district. And what you see is that with the 6-month smoothing, you can still see a lot of the volatility, from seasonal change. But in general, over the course of this year, so year to date through November, what you're seeing is that residential total value of construction starts has actually gone down 23%, non-residential down just a little, and non-building up a little. Actually, that number is actually bigger. I think I missed the decimal point there. That's actually up 11%. I apologize for that. Don't know how that snuck in there. I apologize. So non-building is actually up 11%. And then as the keynote conversation discussed is that from a residential building perspective, what you're seeing is that there has been a bigger, I don't want to even call it gradual because it's only over 2 years, but you're seeing a stair step effect in terms of single family permits in the 9th district. So we've seen a fairly notable decline in single family permits. Multifamily really has, 2022 really was quite a good year yet, but we have seen a significant decline in 2023 across the district in terms of the number of units that we're seeing in multifamily. David also discussed that in his remarks as well. So, excuse me. So some of the other activity that we ask firms about is we're really interested in what they're seeing for future projects. So what the industry calls requests for proposals or new projects. And there's a couple of things here to see. So the top chart is the request for proposals for private projects. And what you saw is last year is when we really saw a change in the market in terms of what they were seeing in terms of new projects coming online for potential business. That's really unchanged from last year. In terms of RFP for public projects, that has always been slightly negative, and I'm not sure that actually is necessarily reflective of the current environment. It did actually improve in the most recent survey just a little bit in terms of those that we're seeing increased. I think this might also reflect a little bit of the nature of that project Python that David was referring to in terms of the slowness sometimes of federal infrastructure spending coming online. I think it also has something to do with the fact that more firms that are in this space are very large. So a lot of small firms might be saying we're not seeing a lot in this space, but this is really an industry kind of dominated by large firms, large projects. We also asked them about backlogs, and we are seeing that those are really shrinking, especially in residential. I don't think we should really be surprised. It really is stemming from we're seeing a high cancellation rate of projects, at least more so than we were seeing earlier in the pandemic. And then we're also seeing that there are fewer new projects out there, and so firms are just pulling a lot of that backlog, which was really significant for a while, and they're pulling that work forward. So their backlogs are also shrinking, and we're not seeing that they expect that really to change. If you look at over the course of the last 3 surveys, that little chart on the bottom right, we're not really seeing that sentiment likely to change in our next survey. We hope so, but it doesn't look, the trend is not favorable. So in terms of challenges, many of these are not a surprise to the audience here, but I just want to point out a couple of things. Higher interest rates have become particularly challenging. David mentioned that, especially for Mortenson. That was one of the cases, and we hear that fairly regularly. The material input costs and labor availability challenges have moderated. Might be a sense of that they're just not as important as interest rates are right now. And then we're also seeing, and David mentioned this, that supply chain disruptions really, I don't want to say that they're not a problem, but especially compared to some other things, they're not as much of a challenge as they were, and that they are seeing improvement in that space. So we know that pricing too has, I wouldn't call it good, but it's moderating. Maybe still a little bit high, but if you look at the wholesale pricing, what they are seeing from vendors, that pricing is improving. It's still maybe a touch higher than we would like, but it is clearly improved. And same on the retail end, where prices were significantly higher being passed on to customers, and that has come down fairly notably. Labor demand, we are seeing that more than half of firms have reported that they were hiring, but we are seeing that there's some downward pressure on labor demand right now. The share of firms that reported that they were cutting actually doubled from 2022 to 2023 in November, so that's kind of notable. But as David noted and Neel have noted in the earlier session, total construction is really not reacting like a sector in crisis. Minnesota construction employment right now is actually at an all-time high. So again, there are lots of challenges, but the fact that employment has remained fairly buoyant, I think, is a nice sign. Labor availability, one of the reasons that I think numbers are continuing is that we are seeing a little bit of easing in terms of the difficulty of finding labor. I wouldn't call this good, but it is improved. And finally, we also ask about outlook. And, this is more than a little bit of glass half full and half empty. If you look at the chart on the left, there really is kind of a barbell effect here. Many are pretty pessimistic, but there are also a number, like David, that are optimistic. I think you kind of have to be in this sector because it's always forward looking. But I do think there's an awful lot of caution in the market right now. In terms of sector outlook, you have residential, again, I think for good reasons, that maybe a little bit more pessimistic than some of the others. And with that, I appreciate everyone's time on this particular session. Hopefully it was a nice fill-in for the keynote session. What we're going to do now is we're going to transition to the panel discussions with our 9th district experts. And we're going to start first with labor market. So if I could, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Eric Garcia Luna. Eric, take it away.
Thank you, Ron. Very insightful presentation. Thanks for that overview of the construction industry in our region. As Ron said, my name is Eric Garcia Luna, Regional Outreach Director here with the Minneapolis Fed. And in the next hour, we're going to hear from experts who will dive into some of the aspects that have influenced labor market dynamics in the states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Angelina Nguyen, Research Director with the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development, will walk us through those dynamics in Minnesota. From Wisconsin, we're going to hear from Matthew Curis, researcher and community development specialist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And last but not least, we're going to be hearing from the Director of Business Initiatives at InvestUP, Amy Berkland. So you can learn more about their impressive careers and expertise on our Regional Economic Conditions Conference page at minneapolisfed.org. Each of our experts are going to have about 15 minutes for their presentation. And, at the end, we will move into a more dynamic discussion before we hand it over to my colleague, Joe Mann, who will be moderating the next conversation. And with that, I would like to welcome Angelina Nguyen to talk to us about, what the labor market looks like in the state of Minnesota. Welcome, Angelina.
All right, good morning. My name is Angelina Nguyen, Director of Labor Market Information Office at DEED, or Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development. I'm going to give you an overview of Minnesota's labor market with the latest data we have from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is November 2023 data. The topics I'm going to cover include job growth, unemployment rate, labor force size and participation rate in Minnesota, job growth by supersector, and the ratio of unemployed worker per job opening in our state. And then lastly, I'm going to touch on wage and wage growth. So overall, Minnesota's job growth has been steady post-pandemic. When the pandemic broke out, we lost about 416,000 jobs between February and April of 2020. But since then, we have fully recovered. So overall, job numbers have grown 435,000 jobs, and the private sector's recovery is a little bit better. They lost 386,000 jobs and has regained 407,000 jobs. So fully recover in terms of jobs. As of November, our over the month job growth was 0.3%, which is a slightly faster pace than the national growth rate of 0.1%. And when we look at like a 3-month moving average for job growth, we see the same story, that Minnesota's job growth is slightly faster than the national rate. However, over the year, our job growth rate is a little slower than the US, and I'll touch on that later in the presentation. We have always had a low unemployment rate, even before the pandemic, and it is still the case after the pandemic. As of November, it's at 3.1% compared to 3.7% nationally, and we rank 19th among all states for low unemployment. And we also look at our neighboring states to see what the case is for our area. And our unemployment rate is similar to like Iowa and Wisconsin, not as low as North and South Dakota. And currently our labor force size is a little over 3.1 million people. When the pandemic was declared, it dropped sharply, and that was the case for everyone because of COVID exposure concerns. For Minnesota, interestingly, in the summer of 2020, we saw a spike in our labor force size, and our theory is the financial reality of many workers being out of work due to the pandemic pushed their family members to look for work. And so that could explain the little spike we saw there for labor force size. And then in 2021, we experienced accelerated retirements. We do have an aging population, and with a good housing market, a good stock market, people who had planned to retire anyway just decided to retire a little earlier. So we saw a flat trend for labor force size in 2021. But since then, our labor force has been steadily recovering. However, we're still about 22,000 people smaller or less compared to where we were right before the pandemic. In terms of labor force participation rate, our rate has been hovering around 68% for the last year and a half. Before the pandemic, it was around 70%, and then it dipped to 67% right after. And again in 2021 during the Great Resignation, but has since been steady, although about 2% lower than what it used to be pre-pandemic. And even so, it is one of the highest labor force participation rates in the country. We rank 6th at almost 6% higher than the national labor force participation rate. And that's the case for all of our neighbors as well. So in general, in our region, in our Midwestern region, we have higher labor force participation rate. And we would say that's probably due to the harsh weather that we have here. People come to Minnesota to work. They don't come to hang out. And now looking at super sector employment change. So over the year, Minnesota gained almost 48,000 payroll jobs. And this is what you're seeing is a snapshot of over the year growth in November 2023. So that's over the year, November, we grew 1.6%. Our private sector gained 37,000 jobs and grew 1.4%, which is a decent growth rate, a little slower than the US rate. Most of our super sectors posted positive annual growth. There were 3 that performed well for this November snapshot that you're seeing, as well as generally in 2023, and 4 that did not do well in general in the last year. So the ones that did well are construction, education and health services, and trade, transportation, and utilities. So construction posted positive growth in 7 of the past 8 months of our available data. And in November, it grew 5.3% for employment growth compared to 2.6% nationally. And this was the highest proportional growth of any super sector in our state. The strongest growth has been in 3 sectors, and they are heavy and civil engineering construction, building equipment contractors, and specialty trade contractors. And this aligns with what we've been hearing this morning from our other speakers. Education and health services gained about 27,000 jobs, and this was the largest real job growth of any super sector in Minnesota. And November was the 9th consecutive month that we saw positive seasonally adjusted monthly growth for the super sector. And trade, transportation, and utilities gained more than 15,000 jobs, and this is the 2nd largest real growth of any super sector in our state. On the flip side, we have several super sectors that generally did not do well in 2023. So manufacturing experienced mild job loss in general for 2023. The information super sector for November snapshot declined 3.6% over the year. And it was lost in telecommunication sector and the publishing industries sector. But the US also saw a similar decline for the super sector as well. Financial activities did not post any positive growth in any month in 2023 for Minnesota. Over the year, they lost 7,600 jobs, which is a 4% decrease. And that is the largest proportional decline of any super sector. And lastly, professional and business services lost about 8,000 jobs, which is a 2% decrease. So although Minnesota's over-the-year job growth is a tiny bit slower than the nation, we are in the middle in terms of ranking. So we're at 24th. And that is the case when we look at when we compare Minnesota to our neighboring states as well. North and South Dakota's employment grew faster than ours, while Iowa and Wisconsin grew at a lower rate. And we used the JOLT survey. JOLT is the Job Opening and Labor Turnover Survey to kind of gauge labor market tightness. So 1 job seeker per job vacancy would be a balanced labor market. Less than 1 would indicate a tight labor market. And even before the pandemic, Minnesota had a slightly less than 1 job seeker per job vacancy ratio. And as of October, for every job seeker in Minnesota, there are 2 job vacancies. And we rank 19th in the nation in terms of labor market tightness. And that's the case for the whole country. So overall, the US's ratio is 0.7 job seekers per job opening. And our neighboring states have tight labor markets as well. So in terms of wage growth, it has been decent in the last few years. So Minnesota, this is looking at average earning per hour for all private sector workers. So Minnesota's over the year wage growth has averaged about 3.7% in 2023, which is a little slower than the national average rate of 4.4%. As of November, our average hourly earnings grew 3.4% over the year, and over 3 years, they grew more than 13%, which is decent growth. However, because inflation was really high between mid-2021 and early 2023, most workers are probably still feeling the cumulative effects of inflation over the last 3 years. And our average earning per hour has been consistently higher than the national average by more than $2. And it's higher than our neighbors as well. And this is an attraction point for Minnesota to attract and retain workers in our state. So to summarize our labor market conditions, we have average over the year job growth ranking 24th in the nation. We have low unemployment rate, 3.1%, which has been low before the pandemic and remains low after the pandemic. Our labor force is slowly recovering. It's still smaller than what it used to be pre-pandemic. We have one of the highest labor force participation rates in the country, ranking 6th place, and it has been high long before the pandemic. It's still high, even though it's about 2% lower than what it was in early 2020. We saw strong job growth in construction, education and health services, trade, transportation, and utilities super sectors. And we saw either flat or mild decline in manufacturing, information, financial activities, and business and professional services super sectors. For every one job seeker in Minnesota, there are 2 job vacancies. However, this tight ratio is the case for it seems the nation and our neighbors as well. And we saw slower wage growth than the national rate in 2023, but our average earning per hour remains higher than the nation's and our neighbors. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for having me today. Eric, back to you.
Thank you, Angelina. You have raised some very interesting points. Thanks for that presentation. It's also interesting to see how some of those points align with what we have been hearing throughout this conference. We appreciate it. And our next speaker is Matthew Kuris from University of Wisconsin-Madison. So take it away, Matthew.
Good morning, everyone. I want to thank the Minneapolis Fed for the opportunity to share some brief points about the Wisconsin labor force over the next 15 minutes or so with you. I'm going to build on a couple of the same topics that Angelina talked about, but also talk a little bit about how our labor force is changing in terms of its demographics related to its age structure. So as Angelina talked about just a second ago, Wisconsin's unemployment rate is below the national average. We're at 3.3% in November of 2023. And you also notice that Wisconsin's unemployment rate was below the national average prior to the start of the pandemic. So one of the things that we've been taking note of in the state of Wisconsin is that the pandemic has exacerbated some of the labor force challenges that we saw in the state, but many of these challenges existed prior to the start of the pandemic as well. If we look at the number of job openings in the state of Wisconsin, again, you can see that the numbers are still quite high. They've come off their peak a little bit since the pandemic recovery period. But if we go back to the period prior to the start of the pandemic, even if you account for some of the noise in the JOLTS data, you do see that we were at historic highs for the number of job openings in the state of Wisconsin, which does show that, again, a number of the factors we're seeing related to labor availability in Wisconsin were not just due to the pandemic, but were part of our state's structural conditions. And very similar to the data that Angelina just showed you, this is also the number of unemployed individuals per job opening. And you see that Wisconsin is at 0.6. The number has come up a little bit, but it still remains below pre-pandemic levels, and it does reflect a number of the conditions we see in our neighboring states as well as in the United States. We can also look at our participation rates across time, going back to 1976. You can see that Wisconsin's participation rate for age 16 and over has traditionally been higher than the United States. As previously noted, Wisconsin is traditionally one of the higher states for labor force participation as well. You do see that the participation rates have come down quite a bit since their peak in the late 1990s, and you do see that they came down even more so with the onset of the pandemic. We do see a recent uptick to 65.7% for the third quarter of 2023. This trend has caused a lot of consternation among employers in the state of Wisconsin as well as among some elected officials. But as we'll talk about here in a second, part of this is due to certainly changing participation rates, but also part of it is due to our changing age structure in the state of Wisconsin. Here we can look at participation rates by age group. And we can look at two different data sources for participation rates. One is the current population survey. And one of the things you'll notice is that the state of Wisconsin's participation rate is higher for all age groups, with the exception of individuals age 65 and older. We can see that they're higher for younger workers. We can see that they're higher for the prime working age of individuals 25 to 54, slightly higher for individuals of pre-retirement age, and again, a bit lower for individuals age 65 and older. If we use data from the U.S. Census Bureau's American Community Survey, we see a very similar trend. We see some slight differences in terms of participation rates compared to the current population survey data, especially with individuals aged 25 to 54. But again, we have higher participation rates across all age groups, with the exception of individuals aged 65 and older. And one thing to keep in mind is that participation rates of prime working age individuals, both for men and women, certainly vary across the state of Wisconsin and across the 9th District. But one of the things we do see is that we do have some of the highest participation rates for prime working age men in many counties across Wisconsin, as well as across many of the 9th District states. And here you can see that many counties are in the upper quintile for participation rates among this age group across the United States. And this data set does have some significant margins of error. So we can look at those counties that have a significantly higher than national average rate for prime working age men. And again, you see that those counties in dark red are scattered throughout many of the 9th District counties, as well as throughout the state of Wisconsin. And if you look at it in terms of where hotspots are, those red areas on the map, again, you can see that the district, as well as the state of Wisconsin, has some of the highest participation rates among individuals 25 to 54 who are men. We can do a similar exercise for prime working age women. Here we see individuals 25 to 54 across the state of Wisconsin 9th District. Again, many of those counties are in the upper quintile for the entire United States. And if we look at those that are significantly higher, again, we see that many counties across the 9th District tend to have significantly higher than average participation rates for prime working age women. And again, if we look at it in terms of hotspots across the United States, the state of Wisconsin and 9th District are part of a very large hotspot in the upper Midwest. Now, we certainly know that participation rates have changed among different age groups, particularly after the onset of the pandemic. But we can also think about how the population has changed among different age groups as well. And here we're going back to 1970, going up to the most recent data we have for 2022 for the state of Wisconsin. And we've broken it down into the prime working age population, or individuals 25 to 54, as well as the total working age population, or individuals ages 15 to 64. And one of the things you'll see here is that the prime working age population on a percentage basis and on a numeric basis peaked around the year 2000. The total working age population continued to grow a bit through 2010, but has also peaked and has come down. So when you think about what this does to influence labor availability, we simply have a fewer number of workers of working age and prime working age than we had a decade ago or 2 decades ago. If we look at this on a county by county basis, this looks at changes in total working age population and prime working age population from the 2010 census up to the 2022 estimates that we have to work with. And if you look at those counties in orange, those are the counties that grew on a percentage basis for total working age population and prime working age population. If we look at the number of counties in the state of Wisconsin that grew in terms of their total working age population, it was 12, with only a handful of those being in the 9th district. For the percent change of individuals of prime working age population, we only saw 2, the county of Dane and county of Eau Claire. So we do see very large percentage losses across many of the Wisconsin or northern Wisconsin counties, as well as the counties that would be part of the 9th district. On the flip side, we can look at the change in our population age 55 to 64, or the pre-retirement age population, as well as the population age 65 and older, or those that may be at retirement age or thinking about retirement soon. And here we see a contrast in terms of what we saw in terms of growth for the working age population. We see growth on a share basis and a total numeric basis for individuals age 55 to 64 and 65 and older, with individuals age 65 and older now making up almost 19% of the state's population compared to just 13% a couple decades ago. If we think about employment of individuals age 55 and older, we can also see that this has changed dramatically for many employers throughout the state of Wisconsin, as well as many of the counties that are in the 9th district. If we look at the share of employees that were age 55 and older, going back to the first quarter of 2000, we can see that most counties in the state of Wisconsin had a share of 18% or less. If we step forward to the first quarter of 2023, we can see that many counties have at least a quarter of their employees age 55 or older, with many of the Wisconsin counties being 30.1% or more. So many workers approaching retirement age going forward. If we look at this by the number of employees age 55 and older by industry sector across the state, we can look at the total number of employees, as well as the share of total employment in that industry sector. We see that manufacturing has over 133,000 individuals age 55 or older, number 2 being healthcare and social assistance, 3 being retail trade with almost 74,000, educational services at almost 59,000. And we can see that the total share of individuals of that age group within those sectors is around 25% or more. So many of these employment sectors are going to be facing challenges with retirements going forward, which will also impact labor availability. We can also think about the share of the population age 65 and older by county and what this might mean for labor demand, as well as for demand for certain types of goods and services throughout the state of Wisconsin, the 9th district. We can see that going back to 2000, there were very few counties that had a high share of their individuals age 65 or older. But now we see that many counties in the state of Wisconsin, especially in the 9th district, have at least a quarter of their population age 65 and older. So going back to that labor participation chart over time, we can also think about how participation rates and age structure have influenced these changes over time. If we look at the blue bars, those are the actual changes in participation rate over each time period. So 2000 up to the start of the Great Recession in 2007, the recovery period from 2007 to 2014, and then the post-recovery period from 2014 through the pandemic in 2022. We can see that from 2000 to 2007, the participation rates by age group across those age groups I shared previously had a bigger impact on the declining participation rate than the change in population structure. If we step forward to 2007 to 2014, we do see that changing participation rates did have an influence as well, but the overall impact from our changing age structure was much, much higher, almost accounted for all of the change in the lower participation rate. If we step forward to 2014 to 2022, we can see that the participation rate dropped by 3.8% total. 2.8% of that drop was accounted for by the change in our population structure, while just 1.1% was due to participation rate changes among different age groups. So again, we can see that our changing age structure is having an outsized influence on our changing participation rates. We did see a slight uptick in participation rates as well as labor force numbers recently. So going forward to 2023, 2024, I would expect some of these trends to continue, but the changes from participation rates will probably have a lower influence than changes from our population. With that, my contact information is here. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. Thank you to all of you, and I'll turn it back to Eric.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for that presentation. That was great. A lot of the same topics we're seeing across the board, and those maps were actually quite illustrative of what may be happening in the region. So that was great. Thank you. So we'll actually wrap the presentations part of this session with the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and I think Amy Berglund is ready to walk us through some of those dynamics that are going on in the area. So thank you, Amy.
Good morning. Thank you. I really appreciate this opportunity. I'm going to deviate a little bit from the prior two presentations, and largely because the Federal Reserve of Minneapolis covers our Upper Peninsula of Michigan, which is half of Michigan. We like to think of it as the better half of Michigan, but the Lower Peninsula is covered out of the Chicago Federal Reserve. So we have an extremely rural area, and my organization, InvestUP, just give you a quick overview of maybe. There we go. Just a quick overview of our organization. We are a 501c3 nonprofit economic development organization. Our members consist of both public and private sector, large employers in the area. And our mission is really to drive prosperity across the region. And we do this through a variety of initiatives, through partnerships and collaboratives, which I'll largely touch on later. But we've really been focused on what is impacting our employers the most. Obviously, that's the labor market, and contracting out and gathering our own research and findings. A little bit about the Upper Peninsula. We've really engaged over the last several years in a significant amount of research into the data pertaining to our population trends and our demographics in order to understand where we are and identify where we need to go. This is our region. As I mentioned before, extremely rural. We have 15 very large geographic counties. About 352 miles stretch from the west end to the east, and about 227 miles from the northern tip to the southern tip. And our population has really been hovering around 300,000 for a few decades. Our traditional industries have been natural resource based, mining, forest products, agriculture, tourism, and hospitality. As you can see here, we're in a downward trend in population-wise since 2000, and projected to continue to lose population. In most of our counties, death rates and birth rates are level, and some death rates are exceeding birth rates. Although in 2023, we're seeing signs that this trend has slowed, and in some counties, they've picked up some population. So we've seen a slight uptick. And you'll see, much like Wisconsin, not only are we losing population in our rural area, but our demographics are really shifting towards an older population as well. You'll see in the right-hand graph there, the 2019. Right now, our largest population age demographic is the 55 and plus age group, which is not helpful to the future of our labor market. Probably the most stark data set that we've come across is the loss of our K-12 student population. We have lost nearly 45% since 1970, which obviously is not going to backfill our upcoming retirees and those waves of losses to the labor pool. Population projections, though, seem to indicate some optimism. Like I said, in 2023, we saw a little bit of an uptick. Most of our counties saw a little bit of an increase. We only had 3 counties that lost population, and were projected by 2028 in the orange here to grow. So some promising projections. In the fall of 2022, our Upper Peninsula Collaborative Development Council launched a study, labor market study findings, to better understand where we're at with our regional workforce, especially coming out of the pandemic. Through grants from the Michigan Economic Development Corporation and matching grant from the U.S. Economic Development Administration, we contracted with TIP Strategies to perform a county-by-county account of the labor market, as well as the trends and recommendations and best practices. Here's some of their findings. For a rural region, we have a high concentration of engineering talent, and the presence of higher education in each of our 3 regions is pretty significant. We're blessed to have 3 major universities, a couple of excellent community colleges, tribal colleges, and these institutions not only support the development of our local workforce, but also attract students from outside the region. Another finding was that career and technical training has been increasing across the region. This is a picture of Dickinson County, which is one of our higher manufacturing concentrated industry counties. And one of the reasons for this spike is really the strong advocacy and support from our Upper Peninsula Michigan Works Employment Agency. They have been registering apprentices and 29 historically since December. And they've also served 38 union apprenticeships with WIOA supportive services in 2023. One of the significant statistics from their apprenticeship work is that 80% of these registered apprenticeships are female students and workers. The occupations that they're focused on are CNC operation, computer support and systems, early childhood education, and certified medical assistants. Study also found that we need to target our talent efforts on remote workers, individuals with ties to the area, and those with skills to fill high demand occupations. We also need investments in quality of place, from infrastructure to cultural amenities, so that we can attract and retain workers. While we enjoy a lower cost of living, we are about 91% of the US cost of living. Our household thresholds for making a living wage vary quite a bit from one county to the next. Across the region, many of the most in-demand occupations do not pay or advertise a pay for a median living wage for a typical family of 2 working parents and 2 children. Some exceptions do exist, and they include registered nurses, medical service managers, and post-secondary teachers. Data and recommendations provided in the study are giving our leaders the information they need to target workforce and business development efforts intentionally. Currently, we are taking this information and going county by county to review the findings and recommendations, implement strategies on supportive data from the study. In addition to the labor market study, we have also been engaged in socioeconomic polling. So together with our partners, Innovate Marquette, Smart Zone, and Michigan Works, we hired a national polling contractor to measure the sentiment of our residents. We contracted over two events per year for 3 years, and we'll complete our last polling this April. Each event consisted of phone outreach to 500 random UP residents who were asked a number of questions. And here are some of our more interesting findings. First, we found that for the most part, optimism remains pretty high among UP residents, and that's been pretty consistent over all of the polling events, where we've asked how they feel, if they feel that the UP is on the right track, and most feel pretty good about the way things are going. We also found that over time, from when we started the polling, housing concerns have risen to be the top economic challenge. And this is true for every demographic group. Opportunities for professional advancement are seen to be slight, and many in the working age demographic feel pessimistic about advancing in their profession. Over time, the pessimism seems to grow in most age demographics. So this definitely presents us with a challenge in retaining talent in the region. Population trends are not confined to our Upper Peninsula boundaries. It is a statewide trend which has been recognized by our governor and her administration. She has appointed a council to identify how we need to grow Michigan. The council was established this June to develop a long-term vision for the state. And one of the council work groups was co-chaired by our very own CEO, Marty Fatante. The council submitted their comprehensive report in December. The first strategy, they listed 3 strategies. The first will look at transforming and adequately funding lifelong learning systems and making higher education accessible for all Michigan residents. The second strategy is focusing on supporting entrepreneurs and businesses of all sizes and implementing regional innovation hubs to support attracting more talent and contributing to more knowledge-based business creation and growing. And the third strategy recognizes Michigan's relatively low cost of living and suggests increasing housing stock will support that growth and attracting talent. We do have some positive momentum and reasons to be optimistic about our future. Last year, almost exactly a year ago, the announcement was made that Billerud would move forward with a $1 billion project, which will convert a coated paper mill to paperboard products. And this was matched by a $200 million in state incentives. And this will impact over 800 existing very good jobs in the area. We've been tracking 32 investment projects across the Upper Peninsula spanning 10 counties. And in aggregate, the projects represent over $7 billion of investment in Upper Peninsula projects. They represent retaining over 2,000 jobs and creating almost 2,500 jobs. And these projects include the Billerud project, advancements with Calumet Electronics, the Sulaks construction project on the east end. This includes housing projects, commercial development across the region. Based on what I've talked about already and some that I didn't have time to, we're moving forward with a number of strategies to better position our region in the labor market. So here's a quick peek on some of the things that we're working on. Number one, we held some stakeholder roundtables that consisted of developers, commercial lenders, to determine where the pain points were to address the housing shortage and how we can move projects forward. We advocated to the state legislature and were entrusted with $15 million in 2022 to address the situation. We built out a nonprofit fund which will provide gap financing for workforce long-term housing projects. We currently have 7 housing projects in process. We closed our very first project in December. And if all of these projects move through to closing, we will have impacted 168 new housing units coming online. And these are spread out across the Upper Peninsula. And the fund provides 2 options for financing. One is a cash collateral support to the commercial lender, and the second is a municipal bond purchase to provide municipalities with the cash to build out the infrastructure. In order to raise awareness with students as to the opportunities that exist with employers in the Upper Peninsula, we are hosting an annual 906 Day on Michigan Tech campus. We've set aside the day for UP-based employers to meet with these students. Last September 6th, we had 15 employers who met with over 350 students, and we anticipate this event to grow every year. We are engaging in expanding internships across the region, again, to build off of the university's ability to attract students to the Upper Peninsula, and again, to raise awareness of opportunities through internship placements, which statistically prove to increase talent retention. We've received over 100 student applications for the summer of 2024. And we're currently in the process of recruiting employers and developing a virtual internship interview event this February. We've also partnered with Northern Michigan University to offer a Rural Leadership Fellowship Program. 2 students have been selected for the fellowship opportunity to lead an economic development project, one in the city of Marquette and the second in Schoolcraft County. The program provides a tuition scholarship for 1 year. It's a paid work-based experience where the student will lead an assigned project and is provided with a mentor council that will help support and guide the student throughout the fellowship. And the goal is to grow talent within the economic development environment. We're focusing efforts on early entrepreneurs and early startup assistance at Michigan Tech. The program enlists student talent to support business startups, create stronger entrepreneurial environment and processing. And these are pre-Smart Zone projects, preparing them for moving forward. And building off of our strengths of our natural resource-based economy, we've been awarded a fund management, and it's the first of its kind statewide. It's a statewide fund. It's the Michigan Outdoor Innovation Fund, and it's designed to grow and support, connect, and invest in startups in the outdoor technology and innovation space. Again, thank you for this opportunity to present. We've taken a lot of steps to understand our market and know what needs to be done, and we're pretty optimistic about our future prospects and the opportunities in the region. So thanks again for having us.
Thank you, Amy. Fascinating. It's great to see all the different things that you're doing in order to try to not only understand what's happening in your area regarding the labor market, but also just those additional tools that you're implementing in order to address some of those issues. So with that, thank you all for all your presentations, and we'll start with some questions. I think that one of the biggest stories coming out of the pandemic is the labor market. As some of you pointed out, and Neel talked a little bit about that, that may not be as recent an event as we think, those issues with the labor market, but hiring has been particularly difficult across industries during this time. It has remained pretty tight throughout 2023. And I'm wondering, if you could shine a little more light. I know you touched in some of those points earlier, but shine some more light, if you will, on what's behind that tight labor market. And I'll start with Matthew to give Amy a little bit of a break from speaking. So.
I mean, certainly, I think we've seen the labor market become a little less tight over 2023 compared to some of the prior years, but nonetheless, it does remain quite tight. Certainly, demographics is part of that. As our size of our labor force continues to decline somewhat, that is going to put continued pressure on the size of our labor force. I do also think that workers had a lot of opportunities throughout the recovery from the pandemic. One of the trends that we saw in the state of Wisconsin, and that has been found in some other places as well, is that we saw the number of individuals forming new businesses continue to grow as well. So some individuals may have found an opportunity to go from a wage and salary type employment situation to owning their own business. So that may have put some additional opportunities in people's hands as well.
That's interesting. Thank you. We actually kind of heard some of that before, and that's been a story also to pay attention to. Angelina, anything on that front? What's behind that tight labor market in Minnesota?
Yeah, Minnesota has an aging population and workforce like many of our neighbors. So we've known that around this time we would see the baby boomer generation retire. So that's been a longer term trend that we've anticipated for decades. And it just happens that the pandemic, happened when it did.
Right.
And so the baby boomers who were going to retire did. And then the younger, like age 50 to 59 workers who would have stayed in the labor market until retirement age for various reasons decided to retire early. So that's one factor in the tight labor market that we're seeing. And change in migration also played a role. And part of it was, global shutdown due to the pandemic and the years following 2020. It's just people just didn't move. Part of it is federal migration policy, but we've seen in total, we've seen less net migration to Minnesota in recent years compared to the previous decade, and that's improving, that's changing. So I think as things as the economy as we heal from the pandemic, I think things will go back to a more normal state.
Thank you, Janina. Before we move and we go to Amy for some of the insights here, you talked about migration, and I'm just curious, are you talking about international migration? Are you talking about between states migration? What is happening here?
Yeah, we've seen slower net migration for both international and domestic. And with the most recent, our demographer's office will release their report on population next week, so we'll get more details. But with the latest census numbers, our international migration is improving. So we're gaining more compared to right after the pandemic years. But domestic migration, we're still seeing a small negative net number, and people retire, probably move out of states. College students probably attend school in neighboring states or out of state. So we'll see.
Great, thank you for that. Amy, any insights on that front? What's behind this very tight labor market?
A couple of things, and Matthew touched on this a little bit in his presentation too, is that, even before the pandemic, in our region, we started to see that labor tightening and employers struggling to fill their labor force. And so we also saw those employers start to flip and be looking at opportunities that they hadn't considered before. So looking at automation, looking at labor or wage considerations and kind of how they're competing there. So offering greater wages, raising wages, offering other options and incentives, better flexibility in better flexibility in timing. And so we saw that flip before the pandemic. And so coming out of it, I think these employers were really focused on and zeroed in on how to attract that labor force and retain them moving forward. They had already started that mindset.
Thank you. I think I'm going to just continue that same topic. You talked a little bit about some of the things that employers are doing to attract and retain workers. Wages is one of them, obviously. We heard through the pandemic more flexibility, opportunities to work from home, et cetera, et cetera. What are some of those that just come to mind right away when you think about this is what employers are doing in order to retain that workforce, but also what are some of those things that you were most surprised about in terms of like steps that employers may be taking, if there are any? Otherwise, just generally speaking, what are some of those things? And I'll start with you again, Amy, and then we'll go round.
Okay. Some of the surprising things that we've found in visiting with our businesses is some of them are actually purchasing homes in their communities to offer up as transitional or short-term housing arrangements to attract talent. Some of them are looking at, some of them have instituted paid time off, no limits on paid time off. And some have, to the extent of offering veterinary insurance to, their talent. So, a lot of it's surprising, and they're really getting very creative.
Pets are important. Veterinarian insurance, right? Great. Matthew, why don't we go to you?
Yeah, in talking to employers in Wisconsin, I think we're hearing a lot of the same things that Amy's hearing with her employers in the UP. We're seeing greater interest in allowing for flexible schedules. So things like 4-day work weeks are becoming of greater interest to a lot of employers. Growing interest in apprenticeships, growing interest in working with individuals who may have disabilities. So trying to work with employer training networks that work with those individuals. We're also seeing interest as well in on-site daycare, as well as individuals or employers that are looking at actually helping investments in workforce housing, whether it be through low-cost loans or helping to acquire land around their facilities to build workforce housing or other types of direct investments.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Angelina?
Yeah, so from the data that my office look at, so pay, as others have mentioned, has been a big tool that employees use to attract and retain talent. And especially like in 2021, 2022, and early 2023, the occupations that tend to be more risky in terms of exposure to COVID, and happen to also be lower paying, like retail occupations or like food services or personal care assistants. We saw wage growth that actually beat inflation or kept up with the inflation at the time. So, upwards of 2-digit percentage wage growth for those occupations. So that's a good thing for workers in the lower paying jobs. But we've also seen, we do a job vacancy survey in our office, and what we've seen over the years is more and more employers dropping educational requirements in their job postings. So let's say, 5 years ago, they would have listed, bachelor's degree required as a minimum qualification, or some sort of degree, and now they're more flexible. So they don't require educational attainment, and kind of more like experience. Like, it's okay if you come to the job with hands-on experience or work experience. So they're more flexible in order to draw a bigger pool of applicants.
Thank you. Matthew, I'm going to go to you because you, in your presentation, you talked a lot about demographic changes. I mean, you all did, but you were actually diving in a little bit into what industries they are. Some people of certain ages were concentrated the most. And I'm just wondering, given these dynamics, what sectors of your state's economy are you seeing the most, are being the most impacted by these labor market dynamics?
I mean, I personally think the impacts are pretty broad across many sectors. A lot of places are having challenges finding the workers that they need. Some of it is geographically somewhat different. Certainly in the northern part of the state, the challenges there are a bit greater than they are in the southern and southeastern part of the state. But traditionally, it's been some of those large employment sectors that we have in the state: manufacturing, healthcare, educational services, hospitality. All of those industries are having challenges finding workers right now.
Thank you, Matthew. Amy?
Yeah, I would have to say the same. Healthcare, hospitality, tourism, those were the most probably impacted. Of all were impacted significantly, but same for the rural region up here.
Great. Angelina?
Some similar trends in Minnesota as well. We've seen certain occupations are hard to fill, like personal care assistants or other occupations in nursing homes. Daycare centers are having a hard time finding staff and teachers.
Great. We'll end with one last question because then the next panel is almost ready to take over. So what are some of those learnings? Amy, you talked a little bit about the steps that your state is taking in order to adapt to the reality of the labor market. What are some of those, some of those other things that we can do long term in order to stay on top of issues? What needs to be addressed in order to avoid or improve today's labor market?
One of the things that we're looking at, and in our county by county conversations that we're having to implement the labor market study, is really being intentional about our workforce pipelines and growing them, starting with earlier on in education, starting with 8th graders and high schoolers, and bringing them into the work environments, giving them those experiences, especially with employers in their regions. We're finding that that outreach has been very, very helpful to educate that young talent about the opportunities that are there in their backyard. Also educating our educators who are spending the most time with that young talent, so that they can guide them and be aware of those opportunities that are in their local areas as well. So really developing out that workforce pipeline in an intentional way.
Thank you, Amy. Angelina?
Yes, similar to what the UP is doing, we are anticipating like future needs and making sure that we're training our workforce to be prepared for the skills and the in-demand jobs of the future. So lots of attention in Minnesota on like green, environmental sustainability, that kind of jobs, like pollution reduction. What's anticipating, like what skills will we need in 10, 20 years out, and what can we do now to prepare our workforce for that time?
Great, thank you. And last but not least, we'll end with Matthew.
Certainly, skill development is part of that, anticipating the needs of employers, as well as what skills are going to be lost due to retirement is an important part of workforce development process. But I also think now that with the recovery from the pandemic, employers, economic development professionals, workforce development professionals are recognizing that increasingly components like workforce housing, broadband, quality places, these are all elements that help attract and retain workers to their communities and are part of the workforce development ecosystem.
Thank you so much for all that. Great job with your presentations. And thank you for all the insights that you share on behalf of all of us at the Minneapolis Fed. I really want to thank each and one of you for your time and for sharing all this wisdom with us. We really appreciate it. I think our audience appreciates it too. And next, we're going to hear about regional economic conditions from another panel of experts, moderated by my colleague, Joe Mann. And with that, take it away, Joe. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Eric, and thank you to all of our panelists on our first panel for your great presentations. We're going to be turning it over now to our second and final panel, which I'll be moderating. One quick bit of housekeeping for those following along with the agenda at home. We did have some time budgeted here for a break in the session. We're going to go ahead and skip that just in the interest of time to keep things moving along. And I hope that nobody minds who's following along at home, just to keep the conversation flowing. So this panel is going to be structured pretty much identically to the last panel. We're going to have presentations from 3 economists from the Western states in our 9th Federal Reserve District. The focus is going to be slightly different, though. Instead of focusing on labor markets in isolation, we're going to be focusing kind of more on broader economic conditions. And so sort of the overall economy, business conditions, and maybe a little bit on the outlook for the year ahead. I would be remiss before turning it over to our panelists if I didn't take the opportunity for those who are watching and are interested in the subject. I'd like to promote some information we have on our website at minneapolisfed.org. If you're interested in this, we do have a landing page. Just in the interest of time, I'm not gonna share the screen, but you can go to minneapolisfed.org and click on region and community and find our regional economic indicators dashboard. That includes a bunch of sort of headline macroeconomic indicators on the economy and on the job market. And we've also recently started including the results of a monthly business conditions survey we conduct among firms in the 9th Federal Reserve District, just to ask about what's been happening with business recently and what they expect coming in the coming months. And again, you can navigate to our webpage to find out more about that and to see what that looks like. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. I'm happy to welcome today panelists from the 3 Western states in our district. We're going to have Amy Watson from Montana, David Flynn from North Dakota, and our first presenter is Joseph Santos, and he is the professor and director of the Ness School of Management and Economics at South Dakota State University to talk a little bit about economic conditions in South Dakota. And Joe, if you want to take it away, please feel free. You have the floor.
Okay, fantastic. So thank you, everyone. I'm very grateful for this opportunity. I'm going to jump right in the interest of time. So I'm going to talk about economic conditions as I understand them in the state of South Dakota. I'm going to break this up into 3 or 4 quick pieces. The first one is production. And so just to give you a sense, intentionally dated sense for just the moment of 2021's pie chart, if you think you're looking at a clock, think noon to about 2, that's our agriculture sector. And then if you think you're looking at a clock and think about maybe 5 o'clock all the way to about 9 o'clock, you're looking at finance, insurance, and real estate. And those are our 2 big sectors. What's interesting about this is just some of what you're looking at is a sort of a bloating of fire during the pandemic. So now I'm going to advance the slide, and instead of 2021, we're going to look at 2022, which is actually current for these data. They're a little bit dated. And you'll notice we are starting to look a little bit more like ourselves in terms of equilibrium proportions here, agriculture making up a larger segment of the economy in South Dakota, and then finance, insurance, and real estate slightly smaller. So again, right after the pandemic versus now. I want to dive into these GDP data now and take a look at what year-over-year growth has looked like for these data. So these are 2 time series. Blue, think just what I said, gross domestic product. So these are goods and services, the value of those goods and services priced at current dollars times the quantity of those goods and services, and that's blue. And what you'll notice here, I'm just indexing right at the trough of the recession after the pandemic or during it. And you're noticing this blue increase, and that's just the growth in what we would think of as nominal GDP. If we hold constant, essentially hold constant prices, think of it that way, just conceptually, what we get is the red line, and that is the growth in real terms. Now what I want to do is just look at year-over-year growth in this stuff, measures of stuff, both with prices changing year over year, think blue, and with prices held fixed, think red. So I'm going to take this year-over-year growth, and I'm going to get a bar chart. And so what you're looking at, how to think about this, just pick a blue bar. Let's pick the biggest one, the tallest one, that really tall one. It's an outlier. We're going to forget about it really quickly. But just as a pedagogical device, look at it, go up, turn left, hit a number like 17, use it in a sentence. Nominal GDP grew year over year in that quarter by about 17%. Just take the red bar next to it, go up, turn left, hit a number like 11%. That would be stuff. So that's adjusted for inflation. We see about 11% growth in GDP in that quarter year over year, same quarter from a year ago. Okay, now I just want to fix our focus on the more recent data pieces. So I'm just going to advance the slide, and we're just going to look at the sort of the right half of this. And so there we are. We're just looking at the same exact data, but we're just looking at the right side. And now what you notice is nominal GDP growth in the state has been relatively strong. And real GDP growth, though, stuff controlling for prices has not been. And in fact, we had some negative growth there in the second quarter of 2022 and the fourth quarter of 2022. But now you're noticing real GDP growth rising. So again, that's the stuff we really care about, because we are factoring out the price increases, what we would think of as just the fall in the purchasing power of money, the inflation. So the punchline at this point is that we've had strong nominal GDP growth in the state, but so has everybody when you have 6 and 7 and 8% inflation. But we also have had now more recently a rebound in real GDP growth, which again is the stuff we care about because we're adjusting for inflation. Okay. I want to exploit these data just a little bit. I have to tell you, I'm excited about the red bars because that is a relatively new chain-weighted real measure of GDP growth in the state. And when we look at the blue bar versus the red bar, we see a difference between them. So let's everybody fix on the last far right set of bars. We see a blue bar that hits around 5% and a red bar that hits around 3%. There's a difference there of 2%. One way to think about that is it's a regional inflation rate. It's a change in the purchasing power of money in the region. For a macroeconomist like me, a regional inflation rate's an oxymoron. There is no such thing as regional inflation, except there is, because prices don't adjust the same way throughout the entire country. I want to exploit that a little bit and just get a sense of price pressure in the region. So looking at blue minus red, we get really a measure of regional inflation that I quite like. And what you notice here is probably not too surprising. The state experienced the sort of fall in the purchasing power of money that the nation experienced. But we've seen now a disinflation, a fall in the inflation rate for South Dakota. And just to compare this to the nation, you'll see there is some difference here. So this is a comparable measure for the entire country. And again, you'll notice South Dakota had some rather high or strong price pressures right after the pandemic. Blue is above red. And then you'll notice more recently now, blue has dipped below red. And so we've had a rather pronounced disinflation in the state. And I think that's a really cool way to exploit those two time series to be able to see that. In terms of the contribution to GDP growth, this is just another way of maybe thinking about the pie chart I showed you earlier, just to learn a bit about our state. It's a moment in time. It's the third quarter of 23 compared to the third quarter of 22. But the total growth in GDP, this is real GDP, is the blue bar there, horizontally extending to 5-point-something%. And then you can think about all the other blue horizontal bars as the components of that 5-point-something%. So the largest contributor to that growth was retail trade, construction, ag, finance, and so on. Those are our sort of growth leaders, if you will. And if we overlay on this the country, just the same data, but for the nation as a whole, you'll notice the sort of uniqueness of South Dakota probably in the ways you might imagine. So here we go. That's the United States more broadly. You'll notice similar real GDP growth. The contributors are a little bit different. Agriculture stands out, not surprisingly. Really long blue bar there as a contributor to the state's GDP growth, not so much for the nation. Finance and insurance in particular. Again, you'll see a blue horizontal bar that extends farther than it does for the nation. Again, there emphasizing ag and finance are large, relatively large, we might say disproportionately large components of the state's economy. And I also want to look at personal income per capita because I think there's an interesting decomposition here, an interesting analysis we can do here. So just think blue is per capita income in South Dakota, red is per capita income in the nation. Blue is above red. I think that's interesting because I'm in that state. What explains blue is above red? So what I want to do is just a little bit of in the weeds analysis, but this is the Minneapolis Fed, so we're used to this. It's not because of population growth. In other words, one way to conceptualize why income per capita is rising in the state or is strong in the state is because there's not a lot of capita. There's not a lot of population, but that's not the case. It's actually quite the contrary. We have very strong population growth in the state, as you can see here. So it's not a weak denominator, if you will. It's the personal income itself that is so strong. So let's take a look at this for just a second. I want to decompose it. So income per capita is on the left. And one way to think about getting income per capita is to break it up into income per person, and then people in the labor force, and then the labor force in the population. And it turns out for the state of South Dakota, what's driving this outsized income per capita number, why our number is larger than the country's number, is really coming from those two forces on the right. I'll show you this in a moment, but a lot of the labor force, if you will, is employed, and a lot of the population is in the labor force. And so we are getting relatively high per capita income in the state for two of the three possible reasons. So let me go back. Let me show you that now. I'm just going to show you that employment as a share of the labor force. It's just 1 minus the unemployment rate. And I'll show you the labor force participation rate, and I'll compare it to the United States more broadly. So there it is for South Dakota, a very high employment rate. Once you hit 100%, you have no unemployment, right? So that's a very high employment rate for the state. High for the country as well, but not as much. So we're getting some of the driving force for per capita income in the state is coming from blue is above red. And then there's the labor force participation rate. And this is quite dramatic. And it's the case, I think, for all of the region's economies. We have a very high labor force participation rate relative to the United States more generally. So again, we're working a lot, whether we measure that as employment as a ratio of the labor force, that one, or labor force as a percentage of the population. So just to bring this full circle, in other words, the reason why our number is 69,862 and the United States' number is 68,717, the reason why 69 is bigger than 68 is really coming from our employment rate and our labor force participation rate. 98 is bigger than 96. 68 is bigger than 63. I think the important point here is that 105 is not bigger than 113. So we're working harder, if you will, but the challenge, if I may, is increasing what I'm calling loosely productivity, income per person. The ingredients there, the secret sauce to driving that are more long-term. It's innovation in technology and education and sort of human capital investment. So that takes a while to lift that number. But that's not the driver of growth, relatively speaking, or driver of personal income. Of course, none of this is all that great if you adjust for inflation. And so this is just real per capita income adjusted for inflation. And there you see both South Dakota and the United States in terms of growth, not very high growth recently at all. And that's very intuitive. Falls in the purchasing power of money mean that no matter what your personal income is, it does not buy as much as it otherwise might. And then people. So looking at the employment in the state and sort of where it's coming from. This is just an example. There's going to be a lot of stuff on this slide in just a moment, but just looking at one to explain what we're looking at. These are not the number of people working in, say, government. This is just relative to the pandemic. So the number one, think relative to the pandemic, you have the same number of people employed in this industry as you did at the pandemic. And so what I want to do is make a mess of this. I'm going to bring up all different industries. So there's the mess. And then I'm just going to highlight a few. And so what we're noticing is since the pandemic, in terms of employment growth, we're seeing large employment growth in construction. President Kashkari mentioned that in his opening discussion. We're also seeing it in professional and business services. Some of the other industries, I don't have them all here. I don't want to pollute the scale too much, but some of the other industries, that's not where we're seeing the pronounced growth. So largely in the state right now, construction and professional and business services. Average hourly earnings are rising, and so the pandemic does weird things to averages. When people drop out of employment, of course, the average rises. But now we've been a ways away from that, and we notice average hourly earnings are quite high. So this, again, is speaking to the tightness in the labor market that I think everyone is speaking to. Real quickly, just what does this look like for the nation? This is actually quite high relative to the nation as well. So what I'm going to do is just the very last data point in this picture is South Dakota's data point, obviously. Imagine 50 of these pictures. Let's look at everybody's last data point. We get a heat map, and you'll see dark green means high growth in average hourly earnings, and South Dakota is dark green. So across the nation, I don't want to say we're leading it. I can't tell that from this picture, but we're in that upper quadrant, if you will, in terms of growth in average hourly earnings. The labor market is tight. You would expect this. And then finally, 2 slides, place. And here I'm thinking about real estate markets and housing. President Kashkari discussed this as well. There's been a lot of research done on the effects of interest rates on housing prices. This paper in particular looked at this, I think, in a very interesting way, had a bunch of metropolitan statistical areas, including the one in which Minneapolis County sits, for example, there for South Dakota, and looked at what happens when interest rates go down. And you could read this heat map as these are the different rates at which real estate prices go up when interest rates go down. And so it's just this interesting variation. Not as interesting as the next one, though, because we're not in an expansionary monetary environment. We're in a recessionary, contractionary. So what happens then? Again, when interest rates go up, the way to read the map is that go look at the legend and you'll find the extent to which housing prices go down, right? So interest rates rise, housing prices fall. And so what does it look like for us as a state? Real quick. Here's a transactions price index for South Dakota and the nation. And what you notice is a lot of mirroring here. House prices rose dramatically for the state as well as the nation, but you're also seeing a return, if you will, to something that maybe looks a little more normal, both for the nation and the state. That interest rate sensitivity of housing prices, unsurprisingly, exists in the state as it does in the nation. Last one. If you look at this in terms of median home prices, there's actually been quite a bit of pressure in the state relative to the nation. These are median prices, listing prices, and you'll see for South Dakota, that's blue, actually greater pressure than for the nation as a whole. For a while there, we've returned to something, again, perhaps more normal, and so too has the nation. So lots of housing pressure. We'll talk about challenges, I'm sure. That's the other one. There's the labor market for the state, and then there's housing is another challenge for the state. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Joe, for that presentation. There's a lot to unpack there, and we'll have some questions about that, but we're going to, as in the previous panel, keep that discussion until the end. So I'll introduce our next panelist first, and that's going to be Professor David Flynn, who's Professor of Economics and Finance from the University of North Dakota, and David's going to be presenting about economic conditions in North Dakota.
Thank you very much. So just the same kind of thing. I'm not hearing otherwise. I assume you're seeing my slides and you're hearing me, so we'll go. All right. So for this outlook, I gave some thought, and obviously echoing a lot of the concerns that we've heard and a lot of the discussion we've heard from prior speakers, prior session, the keynote. There's labor market concerns. There's energy sector as another consequential factor for the state of North Dakota, both in terms of its depth and the possible expansion. I have some information in part about the fiscal position of the state of North Dakota, the relative strength of that, and then some of the related issues to both of these would be the topic of migration, because this was a recent success story for North Dakota, attracting people in, but that has somewhat reversed. As always the case, when you look at the state level, there are overlaps, there are dependencies between all these different topics, and so it can be very difficult to unwind some of these things. So North Dakota has been experiencing this labor market issue for a long time. President Kashkari mentioned it at the beginning in the keynote, talking about the oil boom. This really precipitated an enormous labor market problem for North Dakota that really hasn't yet resolved itself. And so the rest of the country came along maybe some 7-8 years later to understand that they were experiencing the same thing with lack of labor resources readily available. It is more difficult for people to move to North Dakota, I think, than other places, though. So that's something that's still out there to be dealt with. But it's impacting industries in most of the state geographically, and most of the industries. I'm hearing things from businesses, expansion plans are at risk. Replacing retirees is obviously a concern too. Construction is one that I hear persistently having these problems. There's a lot of concern about replacement of workers. I actually had one gentleman actually say to me, he's worried that there aren't going to be enough people available who know how to swing a hammer. Which I thought was a drastic way of saying, that we have a serious labor market issue for that sector as a whole. A lot of people have touted the success of the labor market recovery after the COVID pandemic. However, the blue line here is the forecast for the employment in North Dakota made immediately prior. We made it immediately prior to the COVID pandemic. And so you can see there has been a significant recovery after the depths of that COVID decline, but we're only now back on track to where we would have thought we would be based on pre-COVID situations. And so, there's growth for sure, but the labor market is still essentially moving in a very tight window and not really demonstrating the kind of growth that we could exploit for further economic expansion. One of the reasons that this is important, though, is the energy sector as a key driver of growth. Now, that sector is maturing. It used to be something like 4 times the contribution to GDP that agriculture was. It's right now about 2 times the contribution as agriculture. And they're both obviously key sectors. Right now, it's best probably to think of agriculture as sort of a foundational base level activity. And in many ways, it's got lesser volatility. Energy right now is the driver of the boom bust cycle when you're looking at state economic measures, whether it's something like a personal income, whether it's employment or what have you. And that owes itself principally to oil price volatility. This is the North Dakota first purchase price. This, for anybody who wants to compare it, you can compare it to the West Texas Intermediate crude price, but that is essentially going to be almost exactly the same graph, just shifted down a little bit because North Dakota has extra transportation costs that drive that price up. And you can see, the beginning of the 80s, there was minimal oil activity. That price spike, that price increase that we see happening somewhere around 2005, certainly by 2009, really precipitates a massive influx of activity. But the volatility after it does display itself in the oil output. And while we have a recent increase in oil activity again, we do kind of notice that it's after the COVID onset, we did have some decline and a bit of soul searching as that industry decided it was maturing. So it's more than oil, though. Fossil fuels are still the large driver of energy activity. We heard about renewable energy in the keynote. One of the contributors to those renewable energy products are these rare earth elements and critical minerals, and there is a huge push for research into this area in the state of North Dakota right now. I get to work on sort of economic feasibility of rare earth industry type measures right now as a result of this. And so tracking the prices of some of these rare earth elements takes you back to like your high school chemistry class or your high school physics class. And I'm very glad I'm an economist. So the fact of the matter is, though, that one of the reasons there's a big push is that most of these elements can come out of, I should say, the existing fossil fuel production process. That extractive activity, you can use the waste byproducts there to extract these rare earth elements. Doesn't just have to be a significant discovery of a mine like we saw recently in Norway and some other countries. So it's a huge aspect of renewable energy competition to have viable sources for these rare earth elements and these critical minerals. It's obviously a source of international competition too, as we're vying against China and others for some degree of market power in these areas. Now, that energy sector does impact some of the fiscal picture and the demographic picture for North Dakota as well. North Dakota's got a strong fiscal picture. It's been growing reasonably well. But add to that the fact that we have a rainy day fund, which is called the Legacy Fund up here, which takes excess oil tax revenues and puts it into a fund. It's in the billions of dollars right now, and so that's something to keep in mind, that there's an additional resource available, not just current revenues. Presidential election years, since we're in a presidential election year, I get asked questions about these kinds of things all the time. It's actually not as good a year, generally speaking, as prior years. In presidential election years, tax collections go down somewhere between 9 and 20% compared to prior years. And so the fiscal side doesn't look as good. Interestingly, though, for the personal income type measures, presidential election years are actually better, around 150% higher than what you see in others. And so, you can attach any and many interpretations to these kinds of things. One that's plausible is we cut taxes in presidential election years so that people are going to, want to support them, support existing candidates, and that means income can do better potentially, but at the same time, it might mean that fiscal collections are not as good. Long run, the tax collections, you can see here, once oil starts to really become an activity, we see an increase, not an enormous increase, but an increase that's sustained, but also an enormous influx of extra volatility in the tax collections as these things go forward. If you look across the last few biennia, one of the things that gets pulled out of this for me is something of a regular pattern that you can see here. So we have a biennial legislative meeting, and so the budgets are set for 2 years for state government, and then the collections are tracked. So we basically go from month 1 to month 24 as we look here. And there's some interesting factors here, but that second one, the lighter blue, is the COVID biennium. And the interesting thing that comes out of this is no appreciable impact on fiscal positions for the state of North Dakota as far as tax collection goes when you look at the revenue generation here. And so COVID was not a significant downfall, if you will, in terms of the fiscal position. And the same thing holds here when you look at the cumulative tax collections for the state. The yellow line is the current biennium that we're in, some 5-6 months into the biennium now, and you can see we're right on track with what we've seen before. So that actually leads to some suggestion that maybe this negative situation that occurs won't continue. In terms of migration, this has typically been the key cog for economic growth and development in the state, because if you need workers, you had to find them elsewhere. The birth rates are fine here. North Dakota has better birth rates than the national average, but it's not something that solves labor market problems today. And before you think that's kind of a joke, I've actually been asked that, can we birth our way out of this kind of problem? And I guess if you want to live with the problem for 16 or 17 years, you might be able to say that's a viable policy solution. We are actually, the Institute of Policy and Business Analytics is actually about to put a migration intention survey out into the field, looking at the interest and likelihood of people in North Dakota to move within the state or out of the state, and the various reasons why they might, such as, I need a job, I need a better job, career type aspirations, as we heard. So some people think it's about employment just generally, or is it about career prospects? availability of childcare, proximity to family, all these kinds of things. And so we're putting that out there to see why people are moving, as well as looking at recent inflows of people and finding out why they did move to North Dakota. And so migration is obviously then a more proximate solution in terms of timing. And so the energy sector was obviously the big draw, again, as President Kashkari alluded to. But now it's the primary area where we're seeing some outflow. North Dakota actually had a net negative domestic migration going on. So we're losing more people out of the state the last year or so than we're getting in. Cass County is the bright yellow, and you can see about 1,500 people increase from 2021 to 2022. But that Bakken region, that western portion of North Dakota with the oil activity, the dark purple is Ward County, but then that Bakken region, the Williams, the Montreal, Dunn County, they're the big losers, along with Grand Forks, the county where I am located. But they're the big losers of population going on in this time frame as the oil industry matures. And you can see, just going back to the census year 2020, it's the same pattern. Oil has been changing its profile, changing its employment profile, but you're also seeing, you know, the retirements out of those areas, people leaving the region for, you know, warmer, better climates, those kinds of things. But that, you know, that just speaks to some of the pressure that region is going through. As far as looking ahead, there's a real serious foundation for good growth. Opportunistic drivers, energy and renewable energy is a huge area. North Dakota has both the raw materials as well as research institutes that are looking into this, battery technology, all these kinds of things. Labor obviously continues to be the challenge, and we risk growth falling below potential with that still. And it seems like, from what I was hearing today, the problems exist elsewhere, but they might be a different degree of severity here still in that regard. Or businesses are going to have to change their models, look for more technology and productivity increasing technology. Other things, interest rate policy changes, asset prices are in flux, housing prices have had some volatility here. Same thing that we saw in some of the other presentations in terms of home prices are going up because building was going down. And then the last thing, the risks. So I encounter a lot of people who never experienced inflation before. When we had this last bout of inflation, they really never understood what was going on. And so they said, wow, this is a crazy situation and circumstance. And they weren't sure how to make adjustments. And now, as inflation is moderating, they're having the same adjustment problem, and they're not quite sure what they're going to do. U.S. fiscal policy is always something that's on my radar screen, devoid of you know, any kind of semblance of reality typically, and so there's always risks to any economic outlook because of the fiscal situation in the state. And I still come back to recovery in other regions of the country just always pose a threat to North Dakota and the region. You know, it's amusing to say it, and people kind of, you know, think it's a joke, but for whatever reason, weather is obviously the big concern. Cold weather is a big concern for a lot of people, and the other things that go along with it. Construction can be a year-round activity in certain parts of the country, whereas it's a seasonal activity because of weather here. So you can lose those kinds of arguments when you look to supply yourself with labor. But again, those would be, you know, some of the other highlights of risks to the outlook. So thanks very much.
All right. Well, thank you, David, for that excellent presentation. Again, a lot for us to talk about in our discussion session. But we still have yet to hear from Montana, and to speak to us about the Montana economy. We're pleased to have Amy Watson, who's a state economist for the Montana Department of Labor and Industry.
Thank you. Yes, so my name is Amy Watson. I am the state economist with the Montana Department of Labor and Industry, and I'm happy to be here today to give you all a little bit more information about what's going on in the Montana economy. In Montana, as a labor economist, we focus a lot on the labor force. We do have more people in the state, more workers, and a larger labor force than ever before. We've seen pretty consistent growth in our overall employment levels, as well as our labor force, which is the number of people who are either employed or actively seeking work. Our total population has been growing as well, fairly steadily over time. To look more recently, employment during the pandemic fell slightly, about 2% employment loss in 2020, which was a little bit less significant than it was across the rest of the state or rest of the nation. And then really in 21 and 22, we saw those employment gains accelerate very rapidly. In fact, in 2022, the state added nearly 21,000 jobs, which is a record high for Montana. Since then, we've seen employment growth moderate to a rate more consistent with long-run trends. And going forward, the Department of Labor projects about 1% employment growth through 2032. Some of that reduction in overall growth is due to some headwinds in our labor market, like those tight labor markets that other states have been referencing. This shows the employment gains across industries in Montana. You can see it's fairly well distributed in terms of we've been seeing employment gains across a number of different industries. In 2022, when we had all of that employment growth, about 60% of it occurred in 3 industries: in leisure activities, which includes things like accommodation and food service, as well as arts, entertainment, recreation. And then business services, that's those professional services, and construction. So combined, those 3 industries made up about 60% of those 21,000 jobs that we added in that year. Particularly to highlight construction, in 2022, employment grew by 8.3% in construction alone, which ranked us the 2nd highest in the nation for construction employment growth. We've really seen a lot of growth in that industry, and looking forward, we anticipate about 1,000 jobs per year, job openings per year in construction, which is the most of any industry that we project. The next highest is healthcare, which is about 830 jobs per year. As many states have already mentioned, we've seen very low unemployment in Montana. While our employment and our labor force has been growing, our employment growth has outpaced labor force growth, which ultimately drives down our unemployment rate. Right now, our unemployment rate is right around 3%. You can see historically, Montana typically does have lower unemployment than the rest of the nation. And actually, but even for the state, we've seen really low unemployment. So in the first quarter of this year, actually, our unemployment rate hit 2.3%, which was a record low for the state. Indicates very tight labor markets and workforce shortages. So although low unemployment rate might sound good in terms from a worker perspective, the individuals who are looking for jobs can find them relatively easily. But what we're consistently hearing from businesses across the state is that they're having difficulty recruiting and retaining high quality workers. These tight labor markets are not new issues in Montana. This is another way of looking at the magnitude of the workforce shortage, comparing the number of unemployed people in the state to the total job openings. Back in 2008, 2009, we saw that we had about 3 unemployed people for every 1 job opening. So a lot more slackness in our labor market at that point, multiple individuals competing for 1 job posting. But then in around 2014, 2015, that dynamic shifted where we saw about 1.4 job openings per person. And you can see that despite the significant increase in unemployed individuals at the onset of the pandemic, really that was very short-lived, and we've seen that gap widen since then. Now we have over 2 job openings for every 1 unemployed person. There are a number of reasons that we've seen these tight labor markets. From the demand side, our economy has been growing very rapidly. We've had a record, which has increased the demand for labor. So we've had a record high number of job postings, and that certainly has impacted the labor market and overall economic growth in Montana. But from the supply side, as many have mentioned before, we have long-run declines in our labor force participation rates, driven primarily by demographic shifts and the aging of our population into retirement. We've also seen significant impacts of lack of access to childcare, both from access and affordability of childcare impacting Montana parental workforce engagement. And I'll talk just briefly about that momentarily. But overall, we see our labor force participation rate hover around 63%, which is about where it is nationally as well. This chart shows how those labor force participation rates have been declining over the long run, both in Montana and across the US. Typically, we do have higher labor force participation rates than the US, but more recently, we've seen those rates converge with the national average. When we look at these labor force participation rates by age, however, it's important to note that we don't see those long run declines. So in our prime working age population between 25 and 54, we see about 87% of our overall, of that population in the workforce. That's over that 20 or 30 year time frame that is shown on this chart. We see increases in labor force participation rates. This is also the case for every age category. We've seen our labor force participation rates recover from pandemic lows. So it's not that individuals within a particular age category are less likely to work than they were before the pandemic. It's that we've had those consistent shifts from that prime working age population into the population age 65 and up that have significantly lower labor force participation rates. Although it's worth noting that about 20% of our population over the age of 65 is engaged in the labor force, which has been growing over time. So older Montanans are more likely to work than they were historically, but still much lower rates than our prime working age population. Another way to look at this is the primary reasons individuals aren't in our labor force. As you can see, over this 30-year time frame, we've had a pretty big increase in the number of retirees in the state, hitting a record high over 200,000. A state with a little over 1 million people, 200,000 retirees makes up a significant portion of our population. There's also a significant number who are out for school enrollment, may have an illness or disability that precludes them from participating. And then we have about 33,000 Montanans who are at home because they're caring for family. In this particular statistic, we're looking at any family member, so it could be aging adults or children. But specifically, really over the last 5 years, the Department of Labor has been taking a look at childcare access and availability and its impact on parental workforce engagement. And what we find is that there are about 66,000 Montana parents who are unable to fully engage in the workforce due to a lack of childcare. That means that they're either not employed at all, they're out of the labor force, they're working part-time instead of full-time, or they're working reduced hours due to a lack of childcare in that particular week that they were surveyed. Overall, we produce a measure of, we conduct a supply and demand analysis for childcare availability, specifically licensed capacity. Looking at it as a percent of demand, we estimate that licensed childcare capacity meets about 44% of estimated demand in the state. You can see how that varies by county, with about 60% of our counties qualifying as a childcare desert, meaning that there is supply there meets less than a third of estimated demand. Or another way of thinking about that is for every one licensed childcare slot, there are potentially 3 children who may need care. And so that does impact parental workforce engagement. Again, as with many other states in the district, these tight labor markets are not new conditions, and we've been looking at different ways to address them over the last few years. From the demand side, we can either reduce the demand for workers or increase the worker supply. And from the demand side, we've seen investments in labor-saving technology, as well as increases in productivity through effective human capital investments. From the worker supply side, there's been efforts to increase that labor force participation rate through flexible work scheduling, through the increase in the opportunity of telework or remote work opportunities. We've seen that particularly take off over the last couple of years. And then other things that make it relatively easy or easier for those who are in school, who may be retired, or who may be at home caring for family, to also engage in the workforce in some capacity. But really, the biggest thing over the last couple of years has been in-migration. Montana has seen a spike in migration since the pandemic. We've seen about 4.8% growth in our population over the last 3 years due to in-migration alone. That ranks us 4th highest among states for in-migration. since 2020. And you can see how that varies across our states with most of the in-migration occurring in the western portion, particularly that northwest corner. We have some resort communities, pardon me, that have seen a lot of influx of individuals. This measure is a in-migration as a percent of the population. So some of those really dark counties are low population, historically low population counties, particularly Musselshell outside of Yellowstone, which is Billings. That's our largest urban area. And what we have seen is some urban sprawl that's occurring. So some of the highest concentration of in-migration that's occurring is in those counties that are located just outside of some of our more urban areas in Montana. And we've seen that in-migration concentrated in the West. Of course, that does help alleviate some of those tight labor markets in those regions, but that's not the only impact that all this in-migration has had on the state in particular communities. The housing market has seen significant appreciation. Montana currently ranks 11th among states for home price appreciation. Right now, the typical home value in Montana is just over $440,000. That's through the third quarter of last year. And total appreciation since the beginning of 2020, since the pandemic began, is about 56%. So you can see a lot of that appreciation occurred in 21 and 22. It's moderated some, but remained positive. So Montana has continued to see house price growth despite rising interest rates. Our overall home price values have still continued to rise. And in fact, over that period in 21 and 22, they were rising faster than wages. So that created some affordability concerns for many communities, particularly those that have seen significant appreciation. This chart shows, or this map shows, how those appreciation rates vary generally across the state. You can see a lot of the same counties with really high in-migration rates have also seen very high appreciation, and particularly in the Flathead area and the surrounding Northwest region as well. But thankfully, the state, and due in large part to these tight labor markets, has seen very strong growth in income. Right now, our per capita income is about $61,000, which ranks us 29th highest among states. We do tend to fall in the lower half of states, but below the national average in terms of personal income. But our income levels have been rising faster than the rest of the nation, due in large part to significant wage growth. In 2022 alone, Montana ranked 4th in terms of wage growth in the state, as well as some growth in proprietor income as well, in business. Entrepreneurialism and business innovation has been another big driver of income in the state. So all of this income growth has translated to very rapid economic growth in Montana. The pandemic did bring some contraction in the state economy of about 0.3% loss in overall production, but 2021 was really an extraordinary year for GDP growth. We saw 5.6% growth in that year, and then it's moderated since then to a rate more consistent, again, with that long run trend. Looking forward, we still anticipate positive economic growth in the state, due in large part, supported in large part by a very strong labor market. It continued in migration. All that wage and income growth has generated significantly healthy household balance sheets through the accumulation of excess savings. We've also seen continued business growth and innovation that's really helped drive a lot of and support a lot of economic growth in Montana. And looking forward, we are seeing some of those headwinds moderate in terms of inflation being one of the larger headwinds, and then as well as in-migration and productivity enhancements helping us to address some of those labor force concerns with the tight labor market. So with that, I will conclude. We do have a lot of this information available on our website as well. We produce an annual State of the Montana Economy report that's done on around Labor Day every year, and we have that available on our website for those who are interested in taking a look. So with that, I will turn it back over to Joe.
All right. Well, thank you, Amy, and thank you to all of our presenters for joining us today. I'm going to start. Actually, the first thing I want to do is just acknowledge that this is actually, for all of you, your second year in a row participating in this conference. And all three of you, your presentations were right on time from a show business perspective. That's phenomenal. But also the content was great, and we really appreciate that. I'm going to change perspectives just slightly because this event and all of our discussion so far has been focused on the regional economy of the states in the Ninth Federal Reserve District. And I'm a regional economist. But over the last 2 years, I've been speaking more and been asked to speak more by audiences about the national economy because of the sort of shift in focus on that. And I think one thing that's interesting, and I'm gonna start with David on this question because I know you do some economic forecasting work. And I think one thing that's been interesting over the last couple of years that a lot of folks in the profession have acknowledged is really went into 2023 with a lot of economic forecasters expecting not just a slowing, but perhaps even a recession in the economy. And some folks even were calling for a recession to begin in late 2022. As the year went on, a lot of those forecasts started to push the horizon for a recession to begin further out. And indeed, as the year went on, we saw that the economy was, I think, national economy was surprisingly maybe resilient. Employments continued to grow. We know through December, output continued to grow as well. And of course, we've seen some moderation in inflation as well. So all good news. And I just kind of want to know, and again, I'll start with David, just sort of how did that story play out in your state, in North Dakota? Was that surprising to you? And how does that influence your thinking about the outlook for 2024?
Sure. I would say that certainly from the in-state perspective of the U.S., there was an absolute expectation that there would be at least a V-shaped recession, some kind of short, sharp drop in the nation. The expectation was that, in fact, we would ride that out reasonably well. Can't say we wouldn't have had some decline. But national recessions in the past have been good opportunities for North Dakota's economy to benefit, relatively speaking. Again, the reliance on energy, those kinds of situations, some tax changes that have occurred in the last few years have made it a more attractive place. And so, absolutely, I think the inflation led to these concerns, but at the same time, I think what we're going to find out is that the timing of retirements and other things, when inflation hit and wages responded, and that's the other thing, wages started to respond so that we didn't get an enormous workforce decline. In fact, a lot of people stayed in the workforce longer, delay retirement, earnings are going up, delay retirement because I feel like I need to afford things. That really changed some labor force decisions, and so that led to productivity changes. And so I think what we'll see is that broad-based inflation, which also spilled over into wages, meant that we didn't have the output contractions that we thought we would have.
Okay, interesting. Joe, to turn it over to you, what did you see in South Dakota over the last year that might have been surprising compared to the national picture?
Yeah, so during this monetary contraction, interest rates were rising, and as I alluded to a bit in my talk, inflation within the state, price pressures are actually quite high. So on the one hand, there was this narrative about how we were sort of defying the contractionary forces of monetary policy, but of course, if inflation is very high, real interest rates are not. And so I think that the monetary tightening has sort of affected the state with we always talk about long and variable lags. I think this was a little longer than it was for the national economy. And so now there's a real reduction in inflationary pressures in the state. The interest rates remain high. And so that means real rates are high, or relatively high, I would argue, not maybe high enough. But in any case, I think that's starting to bite. So we still have very tight labor markets. But for example, in the case of construction, we're noticing, folks I talk to who are in development, land development, and so on, will say, well, because we locked in early, we could do what we're doing right now, but we could never do what we're doing right now if we had to borrow now, that sort of thing. So I suspect, I'm not predicting a recession for the state by any means, but I think the contractionary effects of policy were a bit lagged because, as I showed, inflation in the state, sort of regional inflation, was actually quite elevated relative to the nation for quite some time. The other thing is agriculture has been strong. Commodity prices have been strong. Unfortunately, belligerent activity being what it is tends to increase prices of grains, particularly when you're talking about the Ukraine and so on. So that has buoyed the state's economy. And then finance, insurance, and real estate, again, has remained buoyant. So those are tailwinds as well. But I think now perhaps we're seeing a little more of a contractionary pressure in places that you would think of as interest rate sensitive than we were, say, 6 or 8 or 10 months ago.
Okay, interesting. Amy, what about from Montana? What are you seeing there? Surprising.
Yeah, I think like the rest of the nation, the state was able to weather that initial increase in interest rates fairly well. Consumer spending continued to outpace that inflation growth. So we still saw that support significant economic growth in the state. And both from the consumer side and from the business side, we've seen pretty rapid growth. Montanans were able to accumulate about 21 billion in excess savings. That's helped support some of those consumption expenses that occurred in 21 and 22. And so even with that combined with significant wage growth, I think really helped buoy our state in terms of avoiding a recession. And it is hard to imagine a recession occurring without significant increases in the unemployment rate, which when you're looking at unemployment rates at record lows and tight labor markets as tight as they were, I think that gave us a lot of room, so to speak, in terms of the slackness in the labor market was a welcome change in terms of the overall labor market picture. And we've seen some, like they mentioned in the Dakotas, we've seen some sort of more recent contractionary evidence of some impacts that are occurring more in late 2023. But they are happening at a moderate pace. It's nothing that appears to be sudden or dramatic. So we're hoping that we can continue to weather it as we move forward.
Okay, well, I'll actually sort of pick up from there, and Amy, I'm going to stick with you first for this next question. So when we do surveys of economic sentiment, particularly like in the region at a regional level, we tend to find that people are more optimistic for their state and especially local economies than they are for the U.S. economy in most areas. And I think that's especially true with the 3 states we have represented in this panel today. But I wonder if you can think of anything, any aspects of your state economy on which you're maybe less optimistic than you are for the national economy.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that are sort of in our corner in terms of in-migration is one of the big ones. But on the flip side of that, our housing market has really been prohibitive in terms of workforce and economic development in a lot of our local communities. So we've seen dramatic in-migration that's just driven up a lot of those home prices, construction growth. We've seen be really strong. And the question then becomes how sustainable is that in the face of these workforce shortages? I think that may be something that's a little less optimistic across the state with our housing market the way it is and continues to be pretty resilient.
Yeah, what about you, David? Anything in North Dakota that you see as maybe more of a challenge than nationally?
I think because I'll echo what Amy was saying. I think housing seems to be one that's on people's mind, and in part here, I'd say that I think perception is muddy. Perception of the housing market is usually based on what an individual is seeing as they try to look for a house or try to sell a house. It's not their market is sort of what they're seeing. They don't look at aggregate data necessarily, and so they don't realize necessarily also like the restrictions they place on themselves when they're looking at housing and such. So, but there's been variability and volatility with housing, not necessarily the level of construction we would expect. But I also think what I see more here with the population flows that we've had and the fact that North Dakota's age dropped through the median age dropped by a couple of years and has stayed lower. you're getting a changed preference for housing. Housing is no longer the lifetime asset. There's a generation that grew up in a housing bubble bursting and no longer view housing as this, it'll always go up in value asset. And so, a lot of apartment building type of activity going on. So I think there's a pivot at some level, but I see local markets not having fleshed that out yet in terms of both the age demographic and the consumer preference aspects of it. And so that's something I think we're not as responsive on right now.
Okay. Joe, what about you? Anything that the others haven't mentioned that you think is a more acute challenge in South Dakota?
Yeah, so echo Amy, echo David for sure. The other piece may be a bit abstract, but I think just very generally productivity. I mentioned that a little bit, but I wonder if maybe that's a long-term headwind. That is there's a great demand for employees, of course, but I think perhaps the need for innovation and technology and a job space that emphasizes those sort of higher human capital features of the labor market might be something worth pursuing in the state in terms of intentional policy and so forth going forward. So I know that's a bit more abstract, definitely housing for, and so forth, but I think productivity is another challenge.
Good. Okay. Well, we're just about to the end of our session here, but I want to get one more question in. I'm going to make it a lightning round question. I want you to think about one thing in your state, or more generally, that you think of as being a challenge or maybe an opportunity that people are not paying enough attention to, that might come up in the next year or so. And I'm going to go ahead and start back with Joe.
An opportunity, I think, is one that has existed for quite some time, and I'll just say it's a sort of a policy mindset in the state that is very sort of focused on free enterprise, and sort of allowing markets to seek solutions, and when that's possible, it tends to happen in this state. So I think that mindset in the state is an opportunity going forward.
Good. Amy, what about you? Opportunity or challenge for the next year, Montana?
I'd say in the state, we really have seen a particular shortage of childcare, and that's, I wouldn't say people in the state are necessarily ignoring it by any means, but it's something that I think is disproportionately an issue in Montana in particular, and is impacting workforce development, and I think will be a big issue moving forward over the next couple of years to look at ways to address that.
Okay, David, we're going to let North Dakota get the last word.
I think a little more risk-taking attitude, particularly when it comes to policy on investment and productivity enhancing types of activities, technology and the like. It's inherently risky. North Dakota does not have a risk-taking mentality, generally speaking, at the policy level. But I think if you're looking for opportunities, now is the time, and there are clear opportunities in many sectors for North Dakota to make that leap.
Good. A challenge and an opportunity. I love it. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. And thanks actually to all of our panelists, and especially the folks behind the scenes at the Minneapolis Fed who've made this happen. I would particularly want to point out my colleague Shannon Lewis, who's been dropping some information in the chats, did a lot of the work behind the scenes to bring this event together today. It's always a great event, and we look forward to it every year. One last thing, I just want to, before we close, you'll be getting some follow-up communication from us if you've never joined us for one of these before and you really appreciated this content, or if you do and you're hungry for more of it. We do have a web page where we list all of our upcoming regional economic conditions webinars. Those are shorter, quicker features. For example, I'll be doing one on our annual manufacturing survey results on February 2nd. Ron Wirtz will be doing one on general business conditions survey later in February. And you can find those all in the link that Shannon dropped in the chat earlier, or on our website, minneapolisfed.org. It's relatively easy to get to. And once again, thank you to everyone for joining us, and best of luck in the new year. We'll see you again. Thank you.